The house was supposed to be empty. I was doing my usual evening shift as a caretaker for an estate agency. This one was a big, colonial-style home at the end of a winding road just outside of town, a house that hadn't had tenants in nearly a decade. It was slated for renovation soon, so they sent me over to check for leaks, pests, and any odd signs of wear. The job was easy. Mostly, it meant I got paid to walk through quiet houses, flicking light switches and ticking boxes on my clipboard. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed the air felt thick, like the house was holding its breath. It was too quiet. Most of the homes I checked felt, well, abandoned. This one didn't. It felt lived in, like someone had just stepped out of a room and would be back any minute. The hallway was lined with family photos, black and white snapshots of kids in swimsuits, a middle-aged couple laughing, a few wedding photos. Usually, houses for sale had all that stuff cleared out, so it struck me as strange that this house still had every single memory nailed up on the walls. I started with the kitchen, making my usual rounds, noting down that the cabinets were creaky, and there was a faint smell of mildew under the sink. Nothing out of the ordinary, but as I moved through the rooms, that eerie, inhabited feeling kept growing stronger. There was dust everywhere, thick layers on tables and window ledges, yet something didn't feel quite right. In the dining room, the long mahogany table was set with plates, glasses, even silverware, like they'd had a dinner party and just left. I bent down, peering closely at the dishes, and noticed something that sent a shiver up my spine. The plates were clean, spotless, without a speck of dust. The chairs around the table were all pulled out at odd angles, as if people had just stood up and walked away mid-meal. I stood there for a minute, listening to the silence. Houses don't feel silent the way this one did. This silence was dense, humming almost like something was pressing down on the air. But I told myself it was just nerves. Old houses creak. They settle. I moved upstairs, feeling the steps give a little under my weight. The second floor was lined with bedrooms, all in varying states of disarray, as though someone had paused in the middle of packing. Clothes were folded on the beds, half-filled suitcases sat open, and the faint smell of stale perfume lingered in the air. But the strangest thing was that none of the beds looked like they'd been slept in, not even disturbed. When I reached the last bedroom, I saw a small wooden cradle tucked into the corner. Inside, a faded pink blanket was arranged carefully, and lying on top was a doll, a porcelain one with large, glassy eyes and hair the color of straw. I felt an instinctive unease looking at it, the way its eyes seemed to be aimed right at the door, waiting for me. Then, from somewhere down the hall, I heard a faint click like a door latch sliding open. I froze, trying to figure out where the noise had come from. Every instinct told me to get out, but there was a strange pull in the air, as if something were urging me to stay, to see. I walked back into the hallway, glancing around. The door to the bathroom was open now, just a crack, though I knew I'd closed it behind me earlier. I slowly pushed it open, the hinges squeaking as it revealed an old, clawfoot bathtub in the center of the room. The tub was dry, but when I got closer, I saw that the inside was scratched, almost gouged in places, as though someone had clawed at it with something sharp. A chill crept up my spine, and as I backed away, I heard another noise, like footsteps, but soft and barely there. My heart pounded as I stepped into the hallway, scanning the dark shadows at the end, trying to see if someone was there. But there was no one. I turned to leave, ready to forget the house, but that's when I noticed the photos along the walls had changed. The faces in the frames were turned, no longer looking straight ahead. Each one was angled toward the hallway, toward me. I took a step back, almost tripping over my own feet, and realized they weren't just looking, they were staring. Each face had an expression of shock or fear, mouths slightly open, eyes wide, like they'd seen something horrifying. That was enough. I bolted down the stairs, heart racing, breath quickening, trying to keep my footsteps silent as if someone were listening. But as I reached the bottom, I stopped cold. There was a figure standing in the foyer, blocking the doorway. At first, I thought it was a shadow, some trick of the dim light. But as my eyes adjusted, I saw the figure more clearly. It was a woman, her face cast in shadows, but I could make out her features, a drawn, hollow face with dark, sunken eyes that held none of the usual warmth or familiarity. She looked like a faded photograph come to life, with an unnatural stillness that made my skin crawl. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, watching me. I took a shaky step backward, and in a trembling voice, I tried to speak. I didn't mean to disturb anything. Il tosco. Her eyes didn't blink. Her mouth was thin, pressed into a flat line, and then she raised one bony finger and pointed up the stairs. No, I whispered, my voice barely audible. But her finger remained fixed, unwavering, and I felt an overwhelming pressure to obey, like something deep in my mind was overriding every rational thought, demanding I go back up. With each step, I could feel the air growing colder, denser. The house seemed to shift, the walls leaning in, the shadows lengthening as I climbed. I reached the top of the stairs, heart pounding, the hairs on my arms standing on end. The hallway stretched out longer than it had before, leading to a door that hadn't been there when I'd first walked through. I could feel something waiting on the other side, something ancient, patient, something that had been here long before me and would remain long after. I opened the door. Inside was a small room, empty except for an old wooden chair in the center. On the chair sat a single item, a dusty, cracked mirror, the glass fogged and smeared. I took a hesitant step forward, peering into the glass, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It was me, but it wasn't. My reflection stared back, but my eyes were wrong, hollow, just like the woman's. My face looked gaunt, almost skeletal, with a sickly pallor that didn't match my real skin. And my mouth, it was stretched into a thin, unnatural smile. I tried to turn, to look away, but my reflection moved with me, mirroring every motion perfectly. Then slowly it raised a hand, not my hand, its hand, and pointed at me just like the woman downstairs had. A whisper filled the room, faint but growing louder, a cacophony of voices layered on top of one another, overlapping, until I could make out a single phrase. You were always here. The room felt like it was spinning, the walls blurring, tilting as the voices grew louder, pressing in from every angle. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I saw flashes of other people, other faces in the mirror, each one staring back with that same hollow-eyed expression, each one pointing at me, trapped within the glass. I don't remember leaving. I don't remember how I got out, or how I made it back to my car. All I know is that when I finally looked up, I was sitting in the driver's seat, staring at the house in the rearview mirror. It looked as ordinary as ever, just a big, empty house in the dark, silent and still. But when I looked down at my hands on the steering wheel, I saw faint smudges of dust on my fingertips. And in the glass of the rearview mirror, I saw a figure standing at the attic window, watching me with hollow, sunken eyes, a hand pressed against the glass as if to wave goodbye. Or maybe to beckon me back. It all started with a book. I was wandering through a used bookstore I'd never noticed before, tucked between a closed cafe and an abandoned dry cleaner. The sign was faded, the windows dusty, and something about the place seemed both timeless and neglected, like it was a secret forgotten even by its owner. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt this undeniable pull, like I'd walked into a place I was always meant to find. The book practically jumped out at me. It was thick and heavy, with a dark leather cover and no title, no author. When I picked it up, I got the strange feeling that it was watching me, like it had been waiting there on that shelf for years, maybe even centuries, waiting for someone like me. I carried it to the counter, where the owner, a pale, silent man with cloudy eyes, gave me a long look before sliding it across the register. He didn't say a word, just watched me leave, and I could feel his eyes on my back the whole way out. It should have creeped me out, but it didn't. I was too captivated by the book, by the mystery of it. That night, I settled onto the couch, cracked open the cover, and felt a strange chill, like a draft had entered the room. The first page was blank, as was the second. But on the third page, words began to appear, written in neat, spidery handwriting that looked almost as if it had been scrawled by hand. I frowned, rubbing my eyes, convinced I was seeing things, but the letters stayed clear, forming themselves into sentences that drew me in. The first line read, "This is the story of you." At first, I thought it was some kind of joke, But the words that followed were a detailed account of the day I'd just had, down to the smallest detail. The coffee I'd spilled in the morning, the conversation I'd had with my boss, even the exact time I'd walked into the bookstore. I felt a prickle of unease, but curiosity got the better of me. I kept reading. The story continued, describing the moment I picked up the book, the way I'd felt the instant I touched it. And then it went further, describing things that hadn't happened yet, things that were about to happen. It wrote that I'd receive a phone call at 11:43 p.m. from someone I hadn't heard from in years, and that I'd say exactly 6 words in response. I stared at the page, feeling a strange mixture of excitement and dread. This was impossible, I told myself. It had to be some kind of trick. I looked at the clock. It was 11:42. My heart started to race as I waited, listening to the silence in my apartment, feeling like I was holding my breath for something I couldn't name. At 11:43, my phone rang. I jumped, heart pounding, and answered it without even looking at the screen. The voice on the other end was one I hadn't heard in a long time. My childhood best friend, Hannah, who had vanished without a trace years ago. She was supposed to be dead. That was what everyone had assumed. But here she was, her voice crackling over the line, familiar and distant, as if she were calling from another world. I didn't know what to say. She only said my name, softly, almost like a plea. And without thinking, I answered with the exact 6 words the book had predicted. "Hannah, I thought you were gone." There was a pause, and then a faint laugh, distant and echoing, before the line went dead. I stared at the phone, then at the book, feeling like I'd fallen into some surreal nightmare. I couldn't explain it, didn't even try to. I went to bed with the book closed tight, telling myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But the next night, it happened again. I opened the book, and the story continued, as if it were being written right there in real time. The next pages described my day in detail, all the mundane interactions, the little moments, right up until I sat down to read it again. And then it told me about something else, a person I would meet, a stranger who would look at me as if they knew me, as if they'd been waiting. The next day, I was sitting in a coffee shop, and someone I'd never seen before, a man with sharp, watchful eyes, sat down across from me. He didn't introduce himself, didn't say a word. He just watched me, his gaze piercing, and then nodded as if in approval before standing up and leaving without a sound. It was just like the book had said. Every night, I read the book, and every night, it knew everything. It knew who I would talk to, what I would say, what I would dream. It was like the book was alive, or like it was writing my life into being with every turn of the page. But soon, things took a darker turn. One night, the book told me that I would see a shadow in the corner of my room, just out of the corner of my eye, and that when I looked, it would disappear. I read the line, my pulse hammering, and felt a strange pressure in the room, like someone was there, watching me. I forced myself to turn, heart racing, and saw something, a dark shape for just a fraction of a second, before it vanished. After that, the book's predictions grew stranger, more disturbing. It started describing things that couldn't be real, visions of places I'd never been, of people I'd never met, but who seemed somehow familiar. I'd read about a woman standing in my kitchen at 3:14 a.m., just standing there, watching me while I slept. I'd read about a man with hollow eyes who would follow me down the street, keeping a perfect distance. And every prediction, every single one, came true. The more I read, the more the book seemed to control my life, steering it into places I didn't want to go. It described conversations I had no memory of, people I supposedly knew but had never met. And worst of all, it started predicting things I would think, thoughts I hadn't had yet, dark thoughts that felt like someone else's. One night, the book said I would dream of a door that led to somewhere I'd forgotten, a place I'd left behind. That night, I dreamed of exactly that, a wooden door at the end of a long hallway with a strange symbol carved into it. In the dream, I felt an overwhelming urge to open it, to step inside. But just as I reached for the handle, I woke up, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding. The next night, the book predicted I would find that same door somewhere in my apartment. I tried to shake off the feeling, tried to tell myself it was impossible, that doors don't just appear. But when I walked into my bedroom, there it was, standing in the corner, the same symbol carved into the wood, pulsing faintly as if it were alive. I didn't touch it. I didn't go near it, but I could feel it there, like a silent invitation, waiting for me to step through. Now, the book's pages are blank. I flip through it every night, desperate to know what happens next, but it won't give me any more answers. And the door won't do away. Every time I leave the room and come back, it's a little closer, inching forward, waiting. Sometimes, late at night, I hear voices on the other side, soft and urgent, whispering my name. I know that if I open it, I'll finally understand. Maybe I'll find out who wrote the book, or what has been watching me. But part of me knows, deep down, that if I open that door, I won't be the one who steps through. It began one morning when I found my alarm clock blinking 12 o'clock. I'd set it the night before, double-checked it even, but there it was reset and blinking like the power had gone out in the night. But there hadn't been a storm, no outages, and all the other clocks were fine. I brushed it off, thinking it was just a fluke, and went about my day. The next morning, though, the clock was blinking again. 12 o'clock. This time, I felt a small prick of unease. Maybe it was the clock's wiring, or maybe I just knocked it somehow. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that. Over the next few days, I started noticing other things. A light left on that I was sure I'd turned off, or a chair slightly out of place, just enough to catch my attention. Little things, each one small enough to dismiss, but together enough to make me uneasy. Then, about a week later, I woke up in the middle of the night. I'd been dreaming, though I couldn't remember about what. My throat was dry, so I went to the kitchen for a glass of water. As I walked down the hallway, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. The front door was unlocked, hanging open an inch or two. I froze, my mind racing. I was sure I'd locked it before bed. I checked it religiously, a habit I'd had since childhood. I crept closer, heart hammering, and locked the door, feeling a chill settle over me. I tried to tell myself it was just a mistake, that maybe I'd been distracted and forgotten to lock it. But I felt that same prickling sense of unease, now stronger than before. The next night, I woke up again, just as suddenly. This time, it was 3:12 a.m., and I was certain that I hadn't woken up on my own. It felt like something had pulled me out of sleep, an unseen force or presence that I couldn't quite shake. My heart raced as I listened to the silence, straining to hear anything out of the ordinary. But there was nothing. I turned over, trying to go back to sleep, but just as I was drifting off, I heard a faint scratching sound, like nails dragging across wood. It was coming from somewhere inside the apartment, somewhere close. I held my breath, my skin prickling, and listened. The sound was so soft that I thought I might have imagined it. But as I lay there, it came again, steady and deliberate. It stopped just as I gathered the courage to sit up, to turn on the light. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I told myself it had been a mouse, or maybe even the building settling. I went about my day, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that something in my apartment wasn't quite right. The feeling hung over me like a shadow, a weight pressing down on my chest. A few days later, I came home from work to find something strange. In the middle of my living room, there was a single sheet of paper lying on the floor. I picked it up, confused, thinking it might have fallen from a stack of bills or junk mail. But when I turned it over, I froze. It was completely blank. I held the paper up to the light, examining it for anything, a watermark, a faint crease, a sign that it was supposed to mean something. But it was just a blank white sheet placed right in the center of my floor, like someone had left it there deliberately. I searched my apartment, my mind racing, but there was nothing else out of place. Nothing to explain why the paper had been there. I tossed it out, feeling foolish. Maybe I just knocked something over on my way out, and the paper had fallen. It was easier to tell myself that, easier than wondering if someone had been in my apartment. The following night, I heard the scratching again. This time it was louder, more insistent, coming from the wall behind my bed. I sat up, my heart pounding, and strained to hear. The scratching continued, rhythmic and steady, and then it stopped. For a few seconds, everything was silent. I was about to lay back down when I heard something else, a soft, whispering voice, barely audible, coming from the wall. I pressed my ear to the wall, trying to make out the words, but it was too faint. Just a low murmur, like someone speaking in another room. I backed away, feeling the hair on my arms stand on end. I didn't sleep that night either. The next morning, I called my building manager, asking if any maintenance or repairs were scheduled for my floor. He said no, sounding slightly annoyed, as if I'd bothered him over nothing. I wanted to tell him about the noises, about the paper, but I stopped myself. I knew how it would sound. Crazy. Paranoid. But the incidents didn't stop. Over the next few nights, the whispering grew louder, clearer, until I could almost make out the words. It sounded like a voice repeating something over and over, but I could only catch fragments. Then, one night, as I was lying there holding my breath and listening, the whispering finally became clear. "I'm waiting," the voice said, just above a whisper. "I'm waiting for you." My blood ran cold. I sat up, my entire body shaking, and stared at the wall. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. I stayed there, frozen until dawn. When the first light of morning filtered in through the window, the whispering stopped, and the apartment fell silent again. That morning, I packed a bag and stayed with a friend for a few days. I needed to get away, to clear my head, to convince myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But even at my friend's place, I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong, that something was waiting for me back in that apartment. After a few days, I returned to get more of my things, ready to leave for good. The apartment felt different, heavier, as though it was holding its breath. I went to my bedroom and noticed something strange on the floor, a scattering of what looked like small, brittle splinters, like pieces of old, rotting wood. As I bent down to pick one up, I noticed a tiny hole in the wall just above my bed. It was so small that I'd never noticed it before, no bigger than a pinprick. I leaned closer, peering through the hole, and felt a cold rush of air against my face. And then I saw it. On the other side of the wall, just barely visible through the tiny hole, was an eye, pale, unblinking, staring straight back at me. I stumbled back, a scream caught in my throat, but when I looked again, the eye was gone. The wall was solid, just an unbroken stretch of drywall. But I'd seen it. I knew I had. Something had been watching me. I left that day, left the apartment, and never went back. I made excuses to the landlord, broke the lease, moved halfway across the city. I tried to put it behind me, to convince myself that it had just been my imagination. But sometimes in the middle of the night, I still hear it, that soft scratching sound coming from the walls. And every now and then, when I wake up suddenly, in the silence of my new apartment, I feel a cold rush of air against my face, as though something is there, waiting just out of sight. A few years ago, I had a night I'll never forget, no matter how much I'd like to. My best friend, Kevin, had invited me to go urban exploring in a neighborhood on the outskirts of our city. The place was famous locally, mostly abandoned since the late 80s, and nearly every building was empty, crumbling, tagged with graffiti, and strangely quiet. There were rumors about strange lights, old radio signals coming through when you walked by, even stories about people vanishing without a trace. But we were young, dumb, and totally convinced we'd find nothing but broken glass and rusted pipes. So, we headed out after dark, fully stocked with flashlights, cameras, and a few energy drinks. By the time we got there, the place looked more sinister than we'd expected. The street was empty, with every window a dark, gaping hole, and the whole area felt drenched in this heavy, suffocating quiet. But Kevin was amped, practically sprinting to the first building while I tried to keep my cool, feeling a nagging sense of unease creeping up. The first few buildings were uneventful, dusty hallways, old furniture rotting in corners, paper strewn across floors like people had left in a hurry. We wandered, taking photos and making half-hearted jokes about ghosts to keep the mood light. But then Kevin pointed at an old sign, hanging by one rusty nail, that read, "Municipal Record Storage, Authorized Personnel Only." It was barely readable under layers of grime, but it sparked something in both of us. He grinned, daring me to check it out with him, and before I knew it, we were sneaking down an unmarked hallway, deeper into the building. The further we went, the darker it got. The air felt stale, thick with dust, and each step seemed to echo louder, almost like someone or something was listening. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself it was just my nerves, but then we reached a door at the end of the hall. Unlike the rest, it was intact and locked tight, with a strange symbol etched into the paint, almost like a star, but with too many points, distorted and uneven. Kevin, always the brave one, decided to pick the lock, and after a few minutes, the door creaked open. Inside, it was pitch black, the air cold and damp. Our flashlights barely pierced the darkness, but we could make out shelves stacked with old boxes, files spilling out of every corner. We stepped inside, Kevin leading the way, his flashlight sweeping over the room like he was looking for treasure. I was right behind him, straining my eyes when my flashlight caught something strange, a shadow moving in the far corner, shifting just out of reach of the light. I whispered to Kevin, who just laughed, saying it was probably a rat. But as he spoke, the shadow moved again, sliding silently along the wall, coming closer. My pulse quickened, and I shone my light directly on it, expecting to see, well, anything other than what I saw. It was like the darkness itself was alive, a shape that stretched and shifted, twisting in ways that didn't make sense, like ink dissolving in water, constantly reforming. Before I could even react, Kevin whispered, "Did you hear that?" I hadn't heard anything, but he swore he'd heard footsteps. I strained to listen, and slowly, faintly, I began to hear it too, a soft shuffling, like something dragging along the floor. We both froze, the sound getting closer, louder, until it felt like it was right there with us. I looked at Kevin, but his face was pale, his eyes wide as he stared at something just past my shoulder. "Don't turn around," he whispered. Of course, my instincts betrayed me, and I glanced back. My heart stopped. Standing behind me, close enough that I could feel the air go cold, was a figure, tall and thin, wrapped in what looked like an old, tattered coat. Its face was hidden in shadows, but its eyes, oh God, its eyes. They were a dull, milky white, staring unblinkingly as if it saw straight through me. It didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there, watching us like we were intruders in its space. In a flash, Kevin grabbed my arm, yanking me toward the door. We bolted, slamming the door behind us, sprinting down the hallway, our footsteps echoing off the walls as we stumbled back toward the main floor. My chest was tight, my legs shaky, but I didn't look back. We reached the entrance, gasping for air, and burst outside into the open night, the silence of the street feeling like a relief after the suffocating darkness inside. We leaned against the car, catching our breath, our hands shaking. After a moment, Kevin broke the silence, trying to laugh it off. "Did you see that thing?" he asked, forcing a grin, but his eyes were wild, like he was trying to convince himself it wasn't real. I tried to laugh too, brushing it off, saying it was probably a trick of the light or our imaginations playing games in the dark. But just as we were getting into the car, I looked back at the building one last time. And there, in the window of the room we just escaped, I saw it. The figure staring out at us. Those milky eyes locked onto me, unmoving, unblinking, watching as we drove away. We didn't speak about it after that night. Kevin even tried going back once, but he said the door to that room was sealed shut, and the hallway looked different, like it didn't even lead to the same place. Part of me is still curious, wants to know what we saw, what it was doing there. But a bigger part of me is glad I'll never know. All I know is every now and then, in the dead of night, I feel those eyes on me again, watching from the shadows. It started on a random Thursday afternoon when I got an email from an address I didn't recognize. It was short, just a few words, but they were enough to catch my attention. "You left something behind. Come get it." There was no name, just an address on the other side of town in an old industrial district. I almost deleted it. Probably spam, I thought. But as I hovered over the trash icon, something in my mind clicked, a memory that was fuzzy, half-formed, like it had been waiting for the right moment to surface. I couldn't place it, but the address had a pull to it, something strange and familiar that I couldn't quite ignore. I found myself staring at the email for far too long, reading the line over and over. An hour later, I was on my way to the address, telling myself I was just curious. Maybe it was a mistake, a coincidence. But the truth was, I felt like I had to go, like this thing, whatever it was something I'd forgotten, something important. The address took me to an old brick building with cracked windows and faded paint, wedged between two abandoned warehouses. The front door was slightly open, a sliver of darkness visible inside. I hesitated, wondering if I'd lost my mind coming here. But before I could think twice, a shadow shifted just beyond the doorway. A man stepped out, tall and thin, with a face that seemed at once ordinary and unsettling. His eyes were sharp, too sharp, watching me with an intense, almost clinical focus. He looked familiar, but not in a way I could place. "You're here," he said, a hint of a smile pulling at the corners of his mouth. "I wasn't sure you'd remember." "What am I supposed to remember?" I asked, and his smile grew wider, a flash of teeth that didn't quite match the expression in his eyes. "Comin, it'll come back to you," he said, stepping aside to let me pass. Inside, the place was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of old wood and dust. The walls were lined with shelves full of strange items. Books with unreadable titles, bottles of strange liquids, trinkets that looked like they belonged in a museum of the bizarre. I glanced around, feeling that strange sensation of familiarity again, as though I'd seen these things before, but only in dreams. The man led me through a narrow corridor and into a small room at the back of the building. In the center of the room was a table, and on it sat a small, leather-bound book, its cover worn and cracked, the edges fraying. The moment I saw it, my chest tightened. I couldn't explain it, but I felt drawn to it, like the book had been waiting for me. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely more than a whisper. The man looked at me with an odd expression, like he knew something I didn't. "It's yours," he said, his tone flat and certain. "Or at least, it was..." I picked up the book, feeling its weight in my hands. The leather was cool and rough under my fingers, and as I opened it, I felt a shiver run down my spine. The pages were filled with handwriting, my handwriting. It was unmistakable, every word and line written in my own familiar script. I flipped through the pages, seeing notes, sketches, strange diagrams that made no sense to me. But there were also entries, dated in my own hand, yet from years I didn't remember. Entire passages of thoughts and memories that I'd never experienced, places I'd never been, people I'd never met. Did I write this? I asked, but the man only tilted his head slightly, watching me like a scientist observing an experiment. "Look closer," he said softly. I turned back to the pages, focusing on the words, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. One of the entries caught my eye. It was dated 4 years ago, and it read, "I keep having that dream. The door is open, and they're waiting on the other side. I don't know if I'm ready to see them yet." A chill ran through me as I read it. I'd never written those words, but I'd had that dream a dozen times, maybe more. It was always the same, a dark hallway, a door at the end, slightly ajar, and shadows moving just beyond the threshold. I'd wake up every time, heart pounding, a sense of dread lingering long after I opened my eyes. "How did you get this?" I demanded, my voice unsteady. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he held out a small, metal key, old and worn, the edges dull from use. "You left it behind," he said simply. "There are doors you've opened and doors you've closed, but not all doors stay shut." I took the key, feeling its cold weight in my hand. My head was spinning, and that strange sense of déjà vu was growing stronger, almost suffocating. I could feel memories clawing at the edges of my mind, pieces of something I'd forgotten, or maybe something I'd forced myself to forget. "Why don't I remember any of this?" I whispered, more to myself than to him. "Memory is strange," he said, his tone almost kind now. "Sometimes it hides things from us, things it thinks we're better off not knowing. But you asked to remember. You wanted to know what you left behind. What did I leave behind?" My voice cracked, and I felt a rising sense of panic, like I was on the edge of a precipice, about to see something that would change everything. He pointed to a door at the back of the room, barely visible in the shadows. "The answer is in there," he said. "But once you open that door, there's no going back." I stared at the door, my pulse thundering in my ears. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run as far away as I could. But the pull was too strong. That same force that had led me here, that strange familiarity that was no longer just curiosity. It was compulsion. I walked to the door and fit the key into the lock, my hands shaking. As I turned it, the lock clicked, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I looked back at the man, but he simply nodded, his face unreadable. With a deep breath, I stepped through, descending the stairs into the shadows. The air grew colder with each step, and a heavy silence pressed down on me, broken only by the faint echo of my footsteps. When I reached the bottom, I found myself in a small, dimly lit room lined with mirrors. They were everywhere, on the walls, the ceiling, even the floor, and in each one, I saw my own reflection staring back at me, but they weren't quite right. In some mirrors, I looked younger, in others older. Some reflections wore expressions of fear, others of anger, some smiling in ways that felt entirely wrong. And then I saw one reflection that froze me in place. It was me, but with eyes that were empty, like they'd seen something they couldn't unsee. As I stared, that reflection leaned closer, pressing its hands against the glass. And then, to my horror, it spoke. "You should have left it behind." I stumbled back, but every reflection was moving now, each version of me pressing against the glass, whispering the same thing. "You should have left it behind." The room began to spin, the voices growing louder, filling the space with an echoing chorus. I clamped my hands over my ears, trying to shut them out, but they only grew louder, their words twisting and merging until they were a single, terrible chant. And then everything went black. When I came to, I was lying on the floor of the room above, the leather-bound book still clutched in my hands. The man was gone, the building silent. I stumbled to my feet, heart racing, and ran outside, desperate for air, for light. But as I looked back, I realized the building itself had vanished. There was only an empty lot, filled with weeds and broken concrete. I looked down at the book in my hands, my own handwriting staring back at me from the cover. I flipped it open, my breath catching in my throat. The last entry was new, dated that very day. "You should have left it behind." And beneath it, in a script that wasn't mine, a final line. "Now you're one of us." I slammed the book shut, feeling a cold dread settle over me. And as I walked away, I caught a glimpse of myself in a passing window, a reflection that watched me with empty, knowing eyes. This is going to sound crazy, but I think my basement hates me. I'm renting an old house, the kind with drafty windows, creaky floors, and plumbing that rattles through the night. The basement is, well, it's what you'd expect. Dark, dusty, with cobwebs in every corner and an old stone foundation that seems to breathe when the wind hits it just right. When I moved in, I swore I'd never set foot down there. It felt wrong, somehow oppressive, like the air was too thick. But I figured it was just the typical creepiness of an unfinished basement in an old house. Things started slowly. The first time I went down there was after my landlord warned me about a leaky pipe by the boiler. I'd avoided the basement up until then, but I had to check it out, so I grabbed a flashlight and reluctantly headed down the stairs. The light barely cut through the darkness, and every step echoed as I descended. At the bottom, I took a look around. There was an old workbench along one wall, cluttered with rusty tools, and a washing machine and dryer from what looked like the early 80s. The smell was musty, earthy, like the room had been sealed for years. But that's not what bothered me. The basement felt aware, like it was watching me. I know how ridiculous that sounds, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I forced myself to check the pipe, and sure enough, there was a slow drip. I made a note to tell my landlord and started to head back upstairs. Just as I reached the second step, I heard a soft thud behind me, like something heavy had dropped. I whipped around, scanning the room with my flashlight, but it was empty. I hurried up the steps, convinced I'd just heard the house settling or something. The next few weeks, I avoided the basement. I'd hear creaks and groans from down there at all hours, but I ignored them. When I needed to do laundry, I'd sprint down, throw my clothes in, and race back up, leaving the basement light on even though I knew it was a waste of electricity. But one night, I woke up to a strange sound, like scratching, faint but persistent, coming from beneath the floorboards. It was subtle at first, then louder, more insistent, as if someone or something was clawing its way up. My heart pounded as I lay there, straining to listen. After a few minutes, the scratching stopped and there was silence. I told myself it was just a raccoon or a squirrel that had gotten into the wall somehow, but the sound didn't feel animalistic. It felt deliberate. Things escalated after that. I started finding things in strange places around the house. An old photo album with pictures of people I didn't recognize sitting on my coffee table, a child stuffed bear on my bed, even though I lived alone and didn't own anything like that. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to hear faint laughter echoing up from the basement, like children playing just out of sight. The worst part was the dreams. Every night, I'd dream of being in the basement, standing at the foot of the stairs, unable to move, staring into the pitch blackness. In the dream, I could hear something breathing in the dark, something close but just beyond my line of sight. Every time, I'd try to turn and run, but my feet wouldn't move, and I'd wake up drenched in sweat, the echoes of that heavy breathing still ringing in my ears. One evening, I finally broke down and called my landlord, asking if he'd ever noticed anything strange about the house. He laughed, brushing it off as nerves. "That old place? It's full of creaks and moans. Adds character, don't you think?" He didn't seem to take me seriously, so I dropped it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more he wasn't telling me. A few nights later, I came home late, exhausted from work, and fell asleep on the couch. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the basement. Slow, dragging footsteps, moving back and forth across the floor beneath me. My heart pounded as I listened, too afraid to move. The steps continued, pacing, almost rhythmic, as if someone was waiting for something. I stayed as still as possible, hoping the noise would stop, but it didn't. Eventually, I gathered the courage to tiptoe to the basement door, pressing my ear against it. The footsteps stopped abruptly, like whoever or whatever was down there knew I was listening. I held my breath, waiting, and then a voice, soft, barely a whisper, from the other side of the door. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, calm, coaxing, like someone tried to lure me closer. I stepped back, heart racing, and bolted to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, waiting for the footsteps to start again. But the house was silent. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I was going to check the basement one last time, maybe take some pictures as proof to show my landlord. Armed with a flashlight, I made my way down, my hands shaking as I gripped the railing. At the bottom, the air felt colder, heavier, like the room was holding its breath. I scanned the basement, and my flashlight caught something strange on the far wall. A small door I hadn't noticed before, tucked behind the old workbench. It was barely 3 feet tall, a little wooden door with a rusty handle. I'd been down here so many times, but I'd never seen it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I crossed the room, crouching down to inspect it. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to leave it alone, but I grabbed the handle and pulled. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow, pitch-black tunnel that stretched farther than my flashlight could reach. The air that wafted out was damp and smelled of earth and decay. I was about to close the door when I saw something move at the edge of the light, a shadow, shifting just out of view. Then from deep within the tunnel, I heard it again, that soft, coaxing whisper, calling my name. I stumbled back, slamming the door shut, my mind racing. I could still hear it on the other side, a faint, persistent whisper, like whoever was down there knew I was listening. I ran upstairs, locking the basement door behind me, and called my landlord again. This time, my voice shook as I demanded answers. He was silent for a long moment before he finally spoke, his tone wary. "Look," he said quietly, "you were the only one willing to rent that place, so I didn't want to scare you off. But you're not the first to complain. The last few tenants heard things, too. Said they felt like they were being watched. One guy even left in the middle of the night, didn't take a single thing with him." I hung up, packed a bag, and left without looking back. I moved in with a friend for a while, desperate to get as far away from that house as possible. But the worst part is that it hasn't stopped. I'll be sitting alone, late at night, and hear the faint sound of footsteps or a soft, coaxing whisper calling my name, as if something had followed me. And every night, I dream of that small, dark door in the basement, waiting for me to open it. It started with a message. Late one night, just as I was about to turn off my phone and head to bed, it buzzed with a notification from a number I didn't recognize. The message was simple. "Did you get an okay?" I stared at the screen, confused. The message had come from a local number, but there was no contact name, no previous conversation thread. I was tempted to ignore it, but curiosity got the better of me, and I replied, "I think you have the wrong number." Within seconds, the response came back. "Are you sure?" Something about the message felt off, a strange, lingering sense of familiarity, but I couldn't place it. I locked my phone, brushed it off, and went to sleep. I figured it was probably some kind of weird prank. But the next morning, the messages continued. I woke up to another one. "It's almost time. Will you be ready?" I replied, "Who is this?" A few minutes passed. Then, "Don't you remember?" That sent a chill down my spine. I didn't answer, and the messages stopped. But all day, I kept glancing at my phone, half expecting another text to come through. I tried to push it from my mind, but the words nagged at me. "Don't you remember?" Remember what? The next few days were eerily quiet, and I almost convinced myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. But on the fourth night, as I was brushing my teeth, my phone buzzed again. This time it was a photo. I set my toothbrush down, unlocked my phone, and felt my heart skip a beat. The photo was of my apartment door. The lights in the hallway were dim, casting long shadows, but it was unmistakably my door, with the small den on the right side, the old brass number 17. I called out to my roommate, Adam, who had just come back from work. He walked into the bathroom, raising an eyebrow. "Did you take a picture of our door?" I asked, showing him the photo. He frowned. "No, why would I do that?" The unsettling feeling grew. I looked back down at my phone and typed, "Who are you? Why are you taking pictures of my door?" No answer. I stayed up late that night, listening for sounds in the hallway, every creak and whisper seeming amplified. But the building was silent, and eventually, I fell into a restless sleep. The following day, the messages started up again, this time more frequent, more insistent. "It's almost time. Don't forget to lock your door. Will you be ready?" Each time, I felt a strange, creeping sensation like whoever was on the other side of that phone knew me, knew things they shouldn't. I tried calling the number, but each time, the call would ring once and disconnect. By the end of the week, I was on edge, barely sleeping, barely eating, my nerves frayed by the constant, unsettling messages that wouldn't stop. Then, one night, I woke up to the sound of my phone vibrating. Groggy, I reached over and glanced at the screen. Another message. "Are you awake?" I bolted upright, feeling a rush of adrenaline. This time, I didn't reply. I lay there, my heart pounding, trying to ignore the dread pooling in my stomach. After a few minutes, another message came through. "Look outside your window." Against my better judgment, I climbed out of bed and went to the window. I was on the 5th floor, so I didn't expect to see anyone. But when I pulled back the curtain, there was a figure standing in the courtyard below, partially hidden in the shadows. They were looking up directly at me. I stumbled back from the window, my mind racing. The figure was tall, dressed in dark clothes, but from where I was, I couldn't make out any details of their face. I could only feel their gaze, locked onto me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Before I could do anything, another message appeared on my phone. "Are you coming down?" My hands were shaking. I texted back, "Who are you?" After a long pause, the answer came, "I'm someone who remembers." I didn't sleep that night. I sat in the corner of my room, staring at my phone, waiting for more messages, more photos, anything. But there was only silence, an eerie, heavy silence that made me question if I was losing my mind. I tried to convince myself it was a prank, some elaborate, sick joke, but something about those messages felt too real, too personal. The next day, things got even stranger. When I woke up, Adam was gone. I figured he'd left early for work, but his car was still in the driveway, his keys and wallet on the kitchen counter. I texted him, but he didn't answer. I called his office, but they said he hadn't shown up. By noon, I was starting to feel a new kind of dread, something deeper, darker, gnawing at me. I sat on the couch, staring at his phone charger still plugged into the wall, his jacket draped over the back of a chair. It was like he'd just vanished. That's when my phone buzzed again. He's safe for now. I gritted my teeth, fingers trembling as I typed. What did you do with him? The response came back almost immediately. You'll see him soon. Just come down. I went back to the window, my hands balled into fists, hoping to catch a glimpse of whoever was behind all of this. But the courtyard was empty. There was nothing, just the cold autumn air and an overwhelming, suffocating silence. Then I noticed something else. My front door was open, just slightly, just enough for me to see a sliver of darkness on the other side. I held my breath, feeling that creeping, tingling sensation of being watched. It felt like my body was moving without me. I found myself walking to the door, my heart thudding, every instinct screaming at me to stop, to run, to hide. But I kept going, stepping into the hallway. And there, at the far end of the corridor, was Adam. Or at least I thought it was him. He was standing perfectly still, back to me, facing the wall. I took a step closer, then another, calling his name, my voice echoing off the empty walls. But he didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. When I was close enough, I reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. But the moment I touched him, he turned, his face twisting into an expression I'd never seen before. His eyes were wide, terrified, his mouth open in a silent scream. He whispered one word, his voice barely audible, as if coming from somewhere far away. Run! I felt a cold hand grip my arm, pulling me back. I stumbled, turning around, but there was no one there. Just my own shadow stretching long and distorted on the floor. I looked back, and Adam was gone. That was 2 days ago. I haven't left my apartment since. My phone keeps buzzing with messages, each one more insistent than the last, but I haven't checked them. I can't bear to look. Every night, I hear footsteps outside my door, faint whispers, like someone standing just on the other side, waiting for me to answer. And every morning, I find a new message, waiting, reminding me. It's almost time. I don't know what they want or why they chose me. I don't know where Adam is, or if he's still him. All I know is that tonight, as the clock ticks closer to midnight, the final message just came through. Don't make us come. It was supposed to be a normal trip to the laundromat. I've been putting off my laundry for weeks, and my tiny apartment's single machine was broken again. I bundled everything up and drove down to the all-night laundromat a few blocks away. It was nearly empty when I arrived. Just an older man sitting in the corner reading a book, and someone I barely noticed at the back, headphones on, staring into space. I picked a machine in the front row, stuffed my clothes in, and dropped in my quarters. As I waited, I sat down on one of the hard plastic chairs against the wall, scrolling aimlessly through my phone. After a while, I got that strange feeling of being watched. I glanced up, and there he was, the guy in the back, staring right at me. He looked to be in his late 20s, maybe early 30s, and was wearing a worn-out, oversized hoodie that practically swallowed him. He didn't look away when I caught his eye, just kept staring with this vacant, almost dazed look, like he'd forgotten he was supposed to act normal. I looked back at my phone, pretending not to notice. But the prickling feeling didn't go away. I glanced up every now and then, hoping he'd be focused on something else, but each time his eyes were still on me, unwavering, like he was studying me from a distance. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe he just zoned out. People do that sometimes. I distracted myself with music, checked my clothes a few times, and when they were finally done, I packed up as quickly as I could, barely folding them before stuffing them into my bag. As I headed out, I risked one last look over my shoulder, and he was still staring, but this time he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile or a friendly one. It was small, barely noticeable, almost like a private joke. I shook it off, left the laundromat, and drove home, determined to forget about it. But the next day, as I was leaving work, I saw him again. I was walking out of the office, and there he was, standing across the street, leaning against a lamppost. At first, I thought I was imagining things. What were the chances, right? But as I walked to my car, I felt his eyes follow me. I tried not to look directly at him, but I could feel his gaze boring into me from across the street. He stayed rooted there, never moving, until I'd driven out of sight. That night, I told myself I'd been mistaken. Coincidences happen all the time, especially in a small city. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, that creeping sense that maybe it wasn't a coincidence at all. A few days passed without incident, and I started to feel a little foolish for worrying. But then, as I was picking up coffee in my usual place on a Saturday morning, I saw him again. He was sitting in the far corner of the cafe, sipping a drink and watching the door like he'd been waiting for me. The second our eyes met, he gave me that same thin, eerie smile. I felt my heart skip, and I wanted to turn around and leave, but I was rooted in place, trying to tell myself it was still just a weird coincidence. I forced myself to order my coffee, and as I waited for it to be ready, I glanced back in his direction, thinking maybe he'd moved on. Maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. But he was still there, eyes trained on me, watching my every movement. My coffee couldn't come fast enough. When it did, I grabbed it, left, and didn't look back. After that, he became an unwelcome fixture in my life. I'd see him in random places, at the grocery store, in a crowded park, even once standing outside my apartment building. He never approached me, never did anything wrong per se. But every time I saw him, he'd just stand there, staring with that distant, detached expression, like he was observing me from the other side of a glass wall. His presence made my skin crawl. One day, after spotting him for the third time that week, I decided to confront him. I was leaving a bookstore, and he was standing on the opposite side of the street, watching me as usual. I squared my shoulders, crossed the street, and walked right up to him. He didn't move, didn't even flinch, just kept staring, expression unreadable. "Why are you following me?" I demanded, my voice shaky, but louder than I expected. He didn't answer right away, just tilted his head slightly, as if the question genuinely puzzled him. Finally, he said, "I'm not following you. I'm just seeing you." His voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was something unsettling about it. It was like he truly believed what he was saying, like it made perfect sense to him. "You show up everywhere I go," I said, my voice wavering. "What do you want?" He smiled again, that strange, private smile, and shrugged. "Maybe I just like to watch." That answer sent a shiver through me. I backed away, heart pounding, and walked as quickly as I could to my car. I was half expecting him to follow, but he didn't move, just stood there, watching me leave. Over the next few weeks, his presence seemed to intensify. I'd see him almost every day, sometimes just for a split second. A glimpse in a passing car window, a flash of that oversized hoodie disappearing around a corner. I became obsessed with avoiding him, changing my routines, taking alternate routes. But it didn't matter. No matter what I did, he was always there. One night, I was lying in bed, exhausted but too wired to sleep, when my phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from an unknown number. My stomach dropped as I opened it. It was a photo of me, taken from a distance through my apartment window. I was lying on the couch, reading a book. The timestamp showed that it had been taken just a few hours earlier. I scrambled out of bed, pulling the curtains shut, every nerve in my body on high alert. I checked the locks on all the doors and windows, heart hammering as I paced the apartment. The sense of invasion was overwhelming. He'd seen me in my own home, in my most private space. My mind raced with questions. How long had he been watching? How close had he come? I called the police the next morning, but they weren't exactly helpful. They couldn't trace the number since it was a burner phone, and they told me there wasn't much they could do without a clear threat or an actual encounter. The photo alone wasn't enough. I left the station feeling more alone and helpless than ever. After that, I couldn't sleep. Every sound, every shadow felt like a threat. I started staying with friends, sleeping on couches, constantly moving around. But no matter where I went, he'd find me. I'd see him standing outside, just out of sight, that eerie, familiar face watching as I passed by a window or hurried down a hallway. Each time I told someone, they'd listen, nodding with concern but always with a hint of doubt in their eyes, like they couldn't fully believe it. One evening, as I was preparing to leave a friend's place, I got another message from that unknown number. "You're making this harder than it has to be." My blood turned to ice. It felt like a command, like he was telling me that my efforts to hide were just a game to him. I don't know what he wants. I don't know if he's some stranger with an obsession, if he's tracking me, or if he's somehow wormed his way into my life with no plan at all. All I know is that he's always there, somewhere in the background, a constant presence that won't leave me alone. Now, every time I go outside, I'm bracing myself, waiting to catch that flash of a familiar hoodie, a glint of that strange smile. I don't know if he'll ever stop, if he'll ever say or do anything to make this feel real enough for someone to believe me. But he's there. I can feel him, just out of sight, watching, waiting, and I can't shake the feeling that, to him, this is only the beginning. After finishing college, I got a job in a new city halfway across the country. I was excited for the fresh start and the opportunity to finally be on my own, away from family and college friends who'd known me forever. I found a small apartment on the 5th floor of an older building in a quiet part of town. It wasn't much, a single room with a kitchenette and a bathroom, but it had a big window with a view of the skyline, and I loved it instantly. For the first few weeks, everything was perfect. I loved walking around the neighborhood, getting to know the cafes and small shops. The building itself was charming but quiet, with only a handful of neighbors, most of them older. I rarely saw anyone except a woman who lived in the apartment across from mine. Her name was Deborah, and she was always friendly, asking me how I was settling in or if I needed anything. She seemed to know everyone's comings and goings, but I chalked it up to her living there for years. One night, about a month into my stay, I came home late from a work event. As I walked down the hallway to my apartment, I heard a faint click, like a door shutting softly. I turned and saw Deborah's door closing just as I got to mine. I thought it was odd since I hadn't heard her open it or seen her outside, but I brushed it off as a coincidence. But that night, I couldn't shake a strange feeling. Just as I was drifting off to sleep, I heard a soft creak outside my door. I sat up, listening, and after a moment, I heard it again. A few seconds later, I heard a faint, rhythmic sound, a slow, deliberate tapping. My heart raced as I lay there, listening, but the noise eventually stopped. I told myself it was probably an old building settling, or maybe Deborah moving around in her apartment across the hall. The next morning, I found a small folded note slipped under my door. It was just a single word, written in neat, precise handwriting. Welcome. It felt strange, a little too personal, but I tried to convince myself it was a neighborly gesture. Maybe Deborah had left it, though something about that idea felt off. Over the next few nights, I noticed more odd little things. My door handle felt cold when I touched it, like someone had just been outside. I heard faint whispers in the hallway, voices that seemed to cut off the moment I approached. And always there was that strange tapping sound, sometimes faint, sometimes louder, like someone was tapping on the walls from inside the building. I finally ran into Deborah one evening in the hallway. She was her usual friendly self, asking how work was going, if I'd met any friends in the city yet. I mentioned the note and the noises, hoping she might know something. She just laughed, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, you'll get used to this building," she said lightly. "It has its quirks." I shrugged it off, but that night the tapping was louder. It seemed to move around, starting at the wall by my bed, then shifting closer to the door. I finally got up, half convinced I'd find someone standing right outside. But when I looked through the peephole, the hallway was empty. The next day, I asked the building's maintenance guy about the noises, hoping he could confirm it was just an old building's pipes or something. He looked at me, then glanced over his shoulder before speaking quietly. "People say this place is history. Strange things have happened here over the years," he muttered, almost as if he didn't want to be overheard. When I pressed for details, he just shrugged, saying something about phantom noises and past tenants. After that, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, like there were eyes on me whenever I moved around my apartment. A couple of nights later, I stayed up late, feeling too anxious to sleep. I'd finally dozed off when I heard something strange, a soft, scratchy sound. I bolted upright and saw, through the shadows cast by the streetlight, a figure outside my window. It was Deborah. She was on the fire escape, staring into my apartment through the glass, her face pale and blank, her eyes fixed right on me. She was standing so still, like she wasn't even breathing. My heart pounded as I stumbled back, trying to keep calm, but she just stood there, unblinking. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but the shock froze me. After a few long moments, she turned and slowly descended the fire escape, disappearing into the night. I barely slept that night, jumping at every small sound, feeling like she could be outside my window at any second. The next morning, as I left for work, I found another note slipped under my door. This one was different. It was a small photograph of me, taken through my own window. In the picture, I was asleep in bed, my head turned slightly toward the window. Written on the back were the words, "Still here." I felt sick. I hadn't told anyone about my insomnia, about lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling. And there was no one who should have been able to take that picture. I decided to confront Deborah, hoping to put an end to this. But when I knocked on her door, there was no answer. I waited, listening, but it was dead silent. After a few minutes, the maintenance guy walked by, and I asked him if he'd seen Deborah that day. He gave me a strange look. "Deborah," he asked, like he wasn't sure what I was talking about. "Nobody by that name lives here." I insisted that she did, that she was my neighbor right across the hall. He shook his head slowly. "That apartment's been empty for months. Last tenant moved out almost a year ago." I felt a chill run down my spine. There was no way that could be right. I'd seen her almost every day since I moved in, talked to her. As I stood there in the hallway, trying to wrap my head around it, I realized I'd never actually seen her coming in or out of the apartment. She was just there like she was part of the building itself. I didn't wait around to find out more. I packed my things that night and left, staying at a friend's place until I could find a new apartment. A week later, I got a package in the mail. There was no return address, but inside was another photograph. This time, it was a picture of me walking away from the building, my suitcase in hand. In the background, faint but unmistakable, I could see Deborah, watching me from the 5th floor window, a strange smile on her face. Written in tiny letters on the back was one final message: "I'll be seeing you." To this day, I don't know who or what Deborah was. And sometimes, in my new place, I swear I can hear tapping on the walls, faint and rhythmic, like someone is still trying to get. The invitation came out of nowhere. I found it wedged between the front door and its frame, a pale gray envelope with my name written on it in spidery handwriting. No return address, no markings, nothing except my name. Inside was a single card with a short message in bold serif type. "You are cordially invited to a private viewing at the Marrow House. Saturday at 8 p.m. Dress well." I stared at it, baffled. I hadn't heard of a Marrow House, nor did I know anyone who'd be inviting me to some mysterious gallery. And dress well? It was oddly specific. I didn't plan on going, of course, but that Saturday evening, I found myself curious, standing in front of my closet, picking out clothes. Maybe it was the mystery or the strange tug I felt each time I thought about the card. Whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to go. The directions on the back of the card led me to an unfamiliar part of town, just on the edge of the city where old Victorian houses sat huddled together, looking abandoned. When I finally found the address, the house stood alone on the corner, taller and more shadowed than the others, its dark windows staring out like hollow eyes. The front door was open, an unusual warmth spilling out onto the sidewalk. I stepped inside, feeling the strange atmosphere settle over me like a heavy blanket. The house was dimly lit by low-hanging chandeliers, each one casting a warm, almost hypnotic glow. Classical music was playing somewhere, soft and haunting. The main hall was filled with people, all dressed in black, as if they'd been there waiting for me. Their faces were familiar, but I couldn't place them. Friends from school? People from town? No matter how I tried to pinpoint who they were, their names stayed just out of reach. A woman with silver hair and sharp, bird-like features approached me. She wore a velvet black dress and held a glass of dark red wine. Her eyes fixed on mine with a knowing look, as though she could see right through me. "Welcome," she said, her voice smooth and low. "We've been expecting you." Before I could respond, she led me through a doorway, down a corridor that seemed impossibly long, stretching far beyond the length of the house. Paintings lined the walls, each one stranger than the last. Distorted faces that seemed to watch as I passed, landscapes that shifted under the low light, colors bleeding and bending. "What is this place?" I asked, feeling a growing unease. She smiled, a tight, closed-lip smile. "This is the Marrow House, where you'll see things that have always been there, just waiting." The next room was vast, much larger than it should have been, given the size of the house. It was empty except for a single painting in the center, mounted on an easel. The woman gestured to it, and I approached, my heart thumping as I drew closer. The painting was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was a portrait of someone who looked exactly like me. Same hair, same eyes, same slightly confused expression. But there was something off. The background was a shadowed version of my apartment, a warped, stretched version of the life I recognized. In my expression, it wasn't one I'd ever made. It was sad, almost defeated, with a dark smear across my cheek, like a shadow that couldn't be wiped away. "Why? Why am I in this painting?" I asked, backing away, my hands shaking. The woman tilted her head, eyes gleaming with a strange satisfaction. "It's one of our collection pieces," she replied. "They capture who you are, or who you might become." My skin prickled as I looked around, noticing the other portraits that lined the walls. Each one looked familiar now, like a twisted mirror of someone I'd once known. Faces from old memories, people from my life, frozen in moments I couldn't remember, with expressions that spoke of things left unfinished. "Who are these people?" I asked, my voice trembling. "People like you," she replied, her voice drifting off as if that was all the explanation I needed. I was ready to leave, my body tense with an instinctive fear. But as I turned to go, she held out her hand, pointing to a narrow door at the back of the room. "You haven't seen the final gallery yet," she said, her eyes glinting. Against every impulse, I felt myself drawn to the door, feeling that same, strange pull I'd felt with the invitation. When I opened it, I found myself standing in a room filled with floor-to-ceiling mirrors, angled so they created infinite reflections. It was disorienting, my own face staring back at me from every direction, my eyes wide with confusion. And then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In one of the mirrors, just behind my reflection, there was a figure. I turned around, but no one was there. Yet in the mirror, the figure stayed, faint at first, then clearer. It was the woman from the front hall, her eyes meeting mine in the reflection, a strange, mocking smile twisting her lips. She raised a hand and waved, slow and deliberate, though I could still feel her standing behind me, perfectly still. The figure in the mirror stepped forward, growing closer, and for the first time, I realized she was holding something, a thin white mask. She lifted it toward my reflection, her fingers curling around the edge, and as she placed it over my face in the mirror, a heavy silence settled over the room. I tried to scream, to back away, but my feet wouldn't move. The mask in the mirror began to tighten, pressing into my skin, melding with my reflection, until I couldn't see myself anymore. Only the white, expressionless face staring back at me, empty and hollow. When I blinked, I was back in the gallery, standing alone in front of the painting. The woman was gone, and so were the other guests. I was alone in the vast, echoing space, the silence pressing down around me. I ran out of the room, down the hall, the twisted portraits watching me as I went. My mind raced, trying to piece together what had just happened, my heart pounding as I reached the front door and burst outside into the cold night air. But as I stepped out, I felt something strange. The air felt thicker, almost electric. I looked down and noticed that the ground beneath my feet was no longer concrete, but a dark, mirror-like surface that stretched endlessly, reflecting a sky I didn't recognize. My surroundings warped and shifted, and I turned to find the Marrow House had vanished, leaving only my reflection in the endless, mirrored expanse around me. And there, staring back from the glassy surface, was not my face, but the face from the painting, the empty eyes, the sad expression, the dark smear across my cheek. The reflection lifted its hand, mirroring my movements perfectly, and smiled. I took a step back, but the reflection stayed, rooted in place, watching me with a look of unsettling patience, as though it had finally taken my place. Then, in the dark silence, I heard a whisper, faint and cold, echoing through the empty space around me. "Welcome to the collection." And with that, my reflection turned and walked away, leaving me staring into the endless void, with only the memory of the Marrow House and the knowledge that wherever it was, it would always be waiting for someone else to join its gallery. It started with a text message. I was sitting in bed, winding down after a long day, half asleep and scrolling through my phone, when my screen lit up with a notification. The message was from an unknown number, but that wasn't unusual. I'd recently been swarmed by spam and scam texts. "Almost there. Be ready. I'm right outside." I squinted at the message, wondering if it was someone who'd gotten the wrong number. I ignored it, set my phone back down, and tried to relax, but just a few seconds later, another message buzzed through. "I can see you." Now I was wide awake, staring at my screen. It was past midnight, and I lived alone in a tiny, quiet apartment on the 4th floor of an old building. Nobody would just be outside. There was no way anyone could see me, not through the thick curtains I kept drawn every night. My first instinct was that it had to be some kind of prank, so I turned off my phone, tossed it on the nightstand, and decided I'd deal with it in the morning. Then, 2 knocks echoed through my apartment. It was coming from my front door. I froze, heart racing, my mind scrambling through all the possibilities. Maybe it was a neighbor, maybe something had happened. But at this hour, my body didn't want to move, but I forced myself out of bed, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the door, I held my breath, peeking through the peephole, expecting to see, well, I didn't know what. But there was nothing, just the empty, dimly lit hallway. I stood there for a moment, listening, feeling the silence pressing around me. And then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard my phone buzz again from the bedroom. I practically sprinted to it, picking it up to find a new message. "Miss me?" I blinked, completely rattled. My hands were shaking, and I scrolled back to look at the number again. It was unfamiliar, but something about it gnawed at the edge of my memory, like I'd seen it before. I opened my contacts and searched for it, but nothing came up. It was just a random string of digits. I sat on my bed, staring at the screen, my thumb hovering over the block button. But before I could press it, another message popped up. "You forgot, didn't you?" I didn't know how to respond. It felt like a trap, like responding might somehow bring this thing closer. But as I sat there, completely paralyzed, my phone vibrated once more. "Come to the window." Every instinct told me not to, but some part of me, a small, almost childlike part, couldn't resist. I crept to the window, pulling the curtain aside just an inch, peering down into the street below. My building faced a narrow, dark street, lined with a few scattered streetlights casting dim, orange glows. But tonight, something was different. There was a figure standing directly beneath my window, looking up. I jerked back, letting the curtain fall shut, my pulse racing. The figure had been hard to make out, but they'd been wearing something familiar, something almost hauntingly recognizable. A dark coat with a torn sleeve, a detail that I remembered all too well. I hadn't seen that coat in years. It was my brother's. The problem was my brother had died 8 years ago in a car accident. I stumbled back, gasping, trying to shake the horrible feeling that crawled over my skin, that icy sensation that made my hair stand on end. I wanted to call someone, maybe even leave the apartment, but I couldn't shake the dread that something was still watching. My phone buzzed again, and I picked it up with trembling hands. "Aren't you going to let me in?" I dropped the phone, staring at it as if it were some live thing about to bite me. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. But I could still feel that prickling on the back of my neck, like I was being watched. I looked back at the window, half expecting to see him again, that dark figure, standing silently beneath my apartment. But the street was empty. My phone lit up once more, this time with a call. The same number. Against my better judgment, I answered, my voice barely a whisper. Who is this?" There was a pause, and then a soft, static-filled voice, just barely audible through the crackling line. "You forgot," the voice whispered, and the familiarity of it made my blood run cold. It was his voice, my brother's voice. "You forgot what you promised." I couldn't breathe. Years ago, not long before the accident, we'd had a stupid, silly conversation about our fears of death, about what we'd do if one of us was the last one standing. I could almost hear him now, laughing as he said, "If I go first, promise me you'll let me in if I ever come knocking." I'd laugh too, telling him I would, that I wouldn't leave him out there alone. But that had been a joke, a moment in time that should have meant nothing. There was no way he remembered that. No way that he'd come back. The silence on the other end of the line deepened. And then he spoke again, almost pleading this time. "I don't want to be alone anymore." I couldn't stop the tears that slipped down my face, but I shook my head, as if he could see me, as if refusing him would somehow make this nightmare end. Then the line cut off abruptly, and I was left in silence, clutching the phone, staring at the darkened screen, waiting for something else. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually I got up and opened my door, stepping into the hallway, hoping, or maybe fearing, that he'd be there waiting. The hallway was empty, stretching out in both directions, quiet except for the hum of the elevator at the far end. I walked down the hallway, almost in a trance, not even sure what I was doing. As I reached the elevator, I heard a sound behind me, a faint, shuffling sound like footsteps. I turned, half expecting to see him, to see that familiar, impossible face. But it was only the empty corridor, stretching into the dim, sterile light. I sighed, feeling ridiculous, and took a step back toward my apartment. Then, right as I was reaching for the doorknob, I heard it, 3 soft, deliberate knocks, echoing from the stairwell. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I backed away, not wanting to see, not wanting to hear. But the knocking continued, persistent, almost desperate. "Let me in," the voice whispered, soft but clear, echoing through the silence. I closed my eyes, pressing my hands over my ears, but it was too late. I knew, deep down, that I'd have to face it. I turned, heart pounding, and pushed open the stairwell door. The stairwell was dark, the light at the top flickering. And there, standing in the shadows, was a figure, his face hidden but his posture unmistakably familiar. My brother, or something that wore his shape, standing just a few steps below me, head tilted, waiting. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words caught in my throat. The figure took a slow, deliberate step forward, his footsteps echoing in the hollow space. "Please," he said, his voice low and broken. "I've been waiting. I kept my promise." The air felt thick, heavy, pressing down on me, and I backed up, inching toward my apartment door. But just as I turned to run, I heard him call my name, his voice soft and filled with an unbearable sadness. I froze, unable to move, feeling the weight of his gaze on me. And then, slowly, almost unwillingly, I turned to face him one last time. He was gone. Just an empty stairwell, silent and dark. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the empty steps, but eventually I turned and went back inside my apartment, locking the door behind me. I never got another message from that number, but sometimes in the dead of night, I still hear it. 3 soft knocks, always at 3:14 a.m., like a promise I made and never kept. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I first noticed something strange. I was sitting in my apartment, scrolling mindlessly through social media, when I got a notification that said, "You have a new memory." It struck me as odd, but social media was always throwing out memories and old posts. I clicked on it without thinking. The screen flashed, but instead of the usual grainy photo or an old status update, there was a video clip. Only, it didn't show up on my phone screen. Instead, the video started playing on my TV across the room, even though I hadn't turned it on. I set my phone down, watching in stunned silence as the video unfolded. It was footage of me sitting in my apartment, right now on my couch, in my exact position, staring at the phone I just put down. I glanced from my phone to the TV, then back to my phone, feeling a chill spread through my limbs. The video wasn't old. It wasn't a memory. It was me right now. For a moment, I felt like I was floating, detached from myself. I checked my phone again, trying to understand what was happening, but the notification was gone. My phone screen was blank, just my usual home screen staring back at me. I forced myself to laugh, brushing it off. Maybe the TV had glitched, or maybe I'd hit some button without realizing it. But as I reached for the remote to turn the TV off, the screen flickered again. A new video was playing. This time, it showed me from a different angle, standing in my kitchen, facing the counter, my back to the camera. But here's the thing, I wasn't in the kitchen. I was still sitting on the couch, staring at the screen, and yet, there I was on the TV, holding a glass of water, staring out the kitchen window with a blank expression. My breath hitched. I looked toward the kitchen, half expecting to see my own reflection there, but it was empty. The kitchen looked normal, untouched, but the figure on the screen, that version of me, was still standing there, staring into the middle distance as if waiting for something. Then, very slowly, the other me turned around and looked straight into the camera. Straight at me. I don't know how to explain it, but in that moment, I felt a connection, a pull, like the me on the screen was aware of me watching. The figure didn't speak, didn't move, just stared with a calm, unreadable expression that sent chills down my spine. I turned the TV off and sat there in silence, feeling my skin crawl. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I scanned the room, looking for cameras or anything that could explain what I'd just seen, but everything was as it always was. Just my small, cluttered apartment. Trying to shake it off, I decided to go outside and clear my head. I grabbed my coat and headed for the door, but as I reached for the handle, my phone buzzed again. Reluctantly, I glanced down at it, and there was another notification. You have a new memory. My hands were shaking as I opened it, bracing myself. The screen flashed, and there was another video. This time, the video showed me standing right where I was, at the door, hand on the handle, looking over my shoulder as though waiting for something to happen. The me in the video seemed on edge, glancing around the room with that same haunted look I was feeling. I took a step back, the phone slipping from my hand. I could still hear the video playing from where it had landed on the floor, but I didn't dare look at it. I felt as though, if I watched it any longer, I'd somehow slip, like reality would loosen its hold on me, and I'd be pulled into the screen, into this strange other version of myself. I left my apartment, feeling dizzy and disoriented, and wandered down the street in a daze. I went to a nearby cafe, somewhere bright and full of people, hoping it would help me shake the feeling that I was still being watched. But even in the cafe, I couldn't escape it. Every reflective surface, every window, every glass display case seemed to show me another version of myself, just slightly out of sync. I'd glance at my reflection, and it would look wrong, like my expression wasn't quite right, like I was watching myself from the other side of the glass. I tried to distract myself by looking at my phone, but when I unlocked it, there was another notification. Would you like to save this memory? I didn't click it. I couldn't. I left the cafe and wandered back to my apartment, half hoping that by confronting whatever was happening, I could stop it. When I got back inside, the TV was on again, even though I knew I'd turn it off before leaving. This time, the screen showed my apartment, empty and dim, like someone had filmed it from a strange, low angle near the floor. The camera panned slowly through the living room, into the kitchen, down the hallway, and finally stopped at my bedroom door. Then it opened. The camera crept into my bedroom, and there I was, lying on my bed, staring up at the ceiling with a blank expression, as though I'd been waiting. The other me in the bed slowly turned their head, looked straight at the camera, and smiled. A slow, eerie smile that I'd never seen on my own face before. And then the screen went black. I stumbled back, feeling a sick sense of dread filling my chest. I ran to my bedroom, hoping, praying that I wouldn't see myself lying there. But the room was empty, exactly as I'd left it. No sign of anyone. No sign of me. My phone buzzed again, louder this time, like it was demanding my attention. I looked down, and this time, the notification was different. Would you like to switch places? My hand shook so badly, I nearly dropped the phone. I tried to ignore it, to clear it from the screen, but no matter what I did, the message stayed there, pulsing insistently. It felt like a command, something I couldn't refuse. I sat down on the floor, staring at the screen, trying to resist the pull. But then I felt it, a strange, magnetic tug, like something was shifting around me. The walls felt like they were closing in, the air thickening, and I could see the edges of the room blurring, distorting like pixels out of place. Without thinking, I clicked no. The screen went black, and for a second, everything around me seemed to freeze. The room fell silent, and I could feel something, a presence, watching, waiting. Then, slowly, my reflection appeared on the phone screen. It was me, but not quite. The other me was smiling that same eerie, detached smile, eyes dark and knowing, as though I'd passed some kind of test. And then they whispered, just barely audible, "Maybe next time." The phone turned off on its own, the screen going blank, and I felt the strange weight in the room lift, like something had let go of me. For the next few days, I tried to return to normal, telling myself it had been a glitch, a nightmare, something my mind had conjured up. But every now and then, I'd catch a glimpse of myself in a reflection, a window, a mirror, even a puddle on the street, and I'd see the other me staring back, always with that slight, unsettling smile. It's been months, and I can't shake the feeling that I'm not alone in my own life anymore. That other version of me is still out there, waiting, watching, biding their time. And every so often, my phone buzzes with a familiar message. "Would you like to save this?" It was about midnight when I saw him. I just finished a double shift, my head pounding from hours of fluorescent lights and the smell of burnt coffee, and all I wanted was to go home and sleep until the world turned over. But the train was running late, so I stood alone on the platform, hugging my coat against the January wind, watching my breath fog in front of me. Then I noticed him, a man standing a little ways down, dressed in a dark coat and a scarf wrapped tight around his neck, with an old leather suitcase balanced at his feet. It wasn't so much his appearance that caught my attention, but the way he was standing there, like he was waiting for something monumental. The suitcase looked battered and worn, like it had traveled more miles than I could imagine. But he stood there holding its handle, as if it held something precious. It struck me as odd, because no one carried luggage around here. This was a commuter line, filled with office workers and night shift staff like me. And there was something about the way he held himself that felt timeless, like he belonged in a black and white photograph, not standing on a grimy train platform at midnight. He must have noticed me staring, because he looked over and gave me a small nod. I nodded back, feeling a bit embarrassed, and quickly looked away. But a few seconds later, he walked over, stopping just short of a polite distance. "Do you know if the last train is already gone?" he asked, his voice soft, as though he were talking to himself more than me. "No, it's running late," I replied, surprised at how formal he sounded. I pointed to the screen, where a line of blinking red text announced yet another delay. He nodded, watching the screen with an almost serene expression, like he hadn't really expected an answer at all. We stood there in silence for a while, and after a minute, I glanced over, half expecting him to wander off. But instead, he gave me a smile, faint and distant. "You look like someone who's carrying a lot," he said, his voice gentle but piercing. "Mind if I ask what's weighing you down?" The question took me aback, and I almost laughed from the absurdity of it. I barely knew this man, yet here he was, asking me about the things I'd spent months trying not to think about. But something about him felt different, like he was genuinely interested, not just making small talk. I shifted on my feet, hesitating. "I guess life's just been heavy lately," I said finally, unsure why I was saying this to a complete stranger. "Long hours, bills piling up, you know. Feels like I'm always running, but I'm stuck in the same place." He nodded thoughtfully, his gaze still fixed on me. "It sounds exhausting," he said, and there was such simple compassion in his voice that I felt my chest tighten. "Sometimes it helps to leave a little of that weight behind. Just for a while." I wanted to scoff, to tell him that leaving things behind wasn't as easy as that. But he looked at me with such understanding, like he knew exactly what I was thinking, and I found myself relaxing, just a little. He was right, of course. Maybe I did need to let go, if only for a moment. "What about you?" I asked, suddenly curious. "What's in the suitcase?" He gave a small, enigmatic smile and crouched down, his hands resting on the top of the case. "Memories," he said simply. "Pieces of things I've left behind. Goodbyes, mostly." "Goodbyes?" I echoed, not sure if I'd heard him right. "Yes," he said, running a hand over the worn leather. "The things we leave behind aren't always gone. They linger in small ways. So, I carry them with me like souvenirs." I stared at the suitcase, trying to imagine what he meant. "That sounds heavy." It is, he agreed, standing up. But some things are too precious to leave behind entirely. They make us who we are. There was something wistful in his expression, a sadness mixed with pride, as though he'd made peace with the weight he carried. The silence stretched between us, deep and comfortable, and for a moment, I felt as if we were the only two people in the world, connected by invisible threads of things unspoken. The train finally rolled in with a loud screech, and I shook myself out of the strange spell he'd cast over me. I stepped forward, half expecting him to follow, but he remained where he was, looking at me with a soft smile. "Aren't you getting on?" I asked, suddenly unsure of everything. The train doors slid open, and I glanced from him to the empty seats, feeling a strange reluctance to leave him behind. He shook his head slowly, almost as if he'd known all along that he wasn't going anywhere. "I'll catch the next one," he said. "But remember, whatever you're carrying, it doesn't have to weigh you down forever. Sometimes letting go isn't losing. It's just setting things free." The train doors began to close, and I stepped inside just as they sealed shut. I turned to the window, pressing my hand against the glass, watching as he stood there on the platform, his figure still and calm, the suitcase resting by his side. He raised a hand in a small, quiet wave, and in that moment, he looked like a piece of the night itself, timeless and untouchable. As the train pulled away, I felt an odd sense of loss, like I'd just left something behind that I couldn't quite name. But there was also a lightness I hadn't felt in months, as though I'd shed something I didn't even know I'd been carrying. I sat down, staring out at the dark landscape slipping by, the city lights stretching into the distance. His words echoed in my mind, looping over and over, a quiet reassurance that letting go didn't mean losing, that I could set things free without abandoning them. When I got home that night, I dug around in the back of my closet, pulling out a small box filled with old letters, ticket stubs, and photographs, things I hadn't looked at in years but couldn't bring myself to throw away. I spent hours sorting through them, touching each piece like it was part of a ritual, a quiet way of honoring the life I'd lived. Some of it I kept. Other things I let go one piece at a time until the box felt light in my hands. And as I closed the lid, I felt a strange sense of peace, as if the things I'd left behind had finally found a place to rest. In the weeks that followed, I often thought of the man on the platform, of his suitcase filled with memories, of his calm and knowing smile. I wondered where he'd gone, what stories he carried with him, and if he'd found the weight any easier to bear. But in a way, it didn't matter. He'd given me something, an invisible gift, a piece of quiet wisdom, and that was enough. Since then, I've learned to carry only what matters, to set the rest free without fear of losing it entirely. And every now and then, when I'm standing on a crowded platform or sitting alone in my apartment, I imagine him there, with his suitcase and his gentle smile, reminding me that life is made lighter by the things we choose to release. I woke up to my own voice. I was mumbling in the dark, the words fading just as I became fully awake. My heart was hammering, my hands clammy, but I couldn't remember what I'd been saying. I knew it hadn't been a dream. It was more like I'd been talking to someone, but there was no one there. The feeling stayed with me, that eerie sense of a presence, of someone listening. I got up, checked my phone for the time, 3:11 a.m., then paced around the apartment, every shadow stretching out like it was watching me. I went to the kitchen, splashed water on my face, and told myself I was overreacting. The next morning, I felt out of place in my own apartment. I couldn't shake the feeling that things were slightly off, like my toothbrush angled the wrong way or the couch pushed an inch too far from the wall. When I sat down to scroll through my messages, I noticed a series of texts that I didn't remember sending. They were all recent from last night. The messages were weirdly simple, a back-and-forth conversation with an unknown number. They'd asked, "Are you ready?" And I had apparently replied, "Yes." The number was unlisted. I tried calling it, but I got the kind of mechanical, dead-end tone you get when the number doesn't exist. Confused, I scrolled further back, but there was nothing. Just that one conversation. Days passed, and the feeling only grew worse. I'd find myself suddenly remembering things I hadn't done. At work, my boss mentioned the extra hours I put in last week, something I had absolutely no memory of. But when he showed me the timesheet, My name and signature were scrawled in my own handwriting. My co-workers even joked about how quiet I'd been while staying late, saying I just sat there, typing in silence, barely looking up. I laughed along with them, brushing it off, but inside I felt this tight, gnawing panic. That wasn't me. A few nights later, I woke up standing in the hallway outside my apartment door in my pajamas, holding my keys. I have no idea how I got there. I remember feeling the cold tile under my feet, the way my body felt stiff, like I hadn't moved for hours. The hallway was dead silent, just a dim, flickering light above me. My skin prickled with that same feeling of being watched. I hurried back inside, locked the door, and barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, I checked my phone first thing. There was another message waiting for me, again from the unknown number. Tonight, it said. Nothing more. I wanted to ignore it, but it was impossible. The message seemed to pulse in my mind all day. I had a knot in my stomach that wouldn't go away, a jittery feeling that had my hands shaking, making me jump at every noise. By evening, I was too wound up to even sit still. I thought about calling a friend, crashing on their couch to get away from my place for the night, but I kept hesitating. Something in me felt drawn to the apartment, like leaving would only make things worse. Around midnight, I dozed off on the couch, the tension finally wearing me down. But it didn't feel like real sleep. It was more like slipping into some heavy, dreamless fog. When I woke up, it was to the feeling of someone standing right over me. I jolted upright, heart pounding, but the room was empty. Then I saw the door. My front door was open, wide open, and there was no sound, no draft, just the stillness of something wrong. I should have closed it right then, should have called someone, but I was frozen. Part of me wanted to see. Part of me felt like I'd been waiting for this. I don't know what I expected, but when I finally got up and stepped toward the door, the hallway was empty. Quiet. But then I saw it, something down at the end in the shadows. It was barely there, almost like smoke. But I could make out a shape, a person just standing there, staring at me, unmoving. I blinked, and they were gone. I backed into the apartment, shut the door, locked it, and then noticed my phone was lying on the table by the door, screen lit up with a new message. Another text from the same number. Come out. I felt my chest tighten. My hands started to shake, my whole body vibrating with the urge to run. But my feet were rooted to the floor. I couldn't explain it, but the message didn't feel like a threat. It felt like an invitation. Against every instinct, I found myself opening the door again, stepping out into the hallway. I walked slowly, feeling like I was moving in a trance, one foot in front of the other, unable to stop myself. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, every step echoing in the silence. And then, just before I reached the stairwell, I heard it, a faint, familiar voice calling my name. I froze. It was my voice, but wrong, like it was coming from somewhere deep and hollow, laced with a strange urgency, pulling me closer. I don't know why, but I followed the sound. I made my way down the stairs, feeling each step sink under me, the air getting colder as I descended. By the time I reached the lobby, the voice had faded, leaving only that heavy, watchful silence. When I stepped outside, the street was deserted, the buildings dark, like the entire city was asleep. But I wasn't alone. There at the edge of the sidewalk stood the figure from the hallway. I could only see the silhouette, but as I stepped closer, I realized that it was me. I stopped, staring, my breath caught in my throat. It was like looking into a mirror that hadn't been dusted in years. My double's face was slightly blurred, hollow eyes dark and unfocused. But the shape, the way it stood, it was me. It lifted its hand, beckoning, and I felt myself drawn forward, unable to resist. I walked up to it, stopping only a few feet away. My double's eyes flicked up to meet mine, and for a brief, chilling second, I saw a flash of something familiar, something almost like recognition. And then it spoke. "We're almost ready," it whispered, and the words came out in my voice, but in a tone so cold and detached it made my skin crawl. "You don't need to remember." Before I could move, the world spun around me. I felt a sudden, unbearable weight in my chest, like something was slipping into place, locking me down, pushing my consciousness deep, deep inside. I could feel my own body, but it was as if I'd been submerged, trapped beneath a thick, heavy layer, unable to scream, unable to breathe. I don't know how long I was out, but when I woke up, I was back in my apartment, lying on my bed, drenched in sweat. The morning light was filtering through the curtains, soft and quiet, as if nothing had happened. But I knew it had. I felt it immediately, that sense of displacement. My movements felt wrong, a second delayed, like I was reacting to commands I hadn't given. I tried speaking, but the words that came out weren't the ones I intended. They sounded like mine, but somehow empty, hollow, as if spoken by someone mimicking my voice. I stumbled to the bathroom, flicked on the light, and looked in the mirror. My face stared back, but my eyes looked dull, unfocused, as if someone else were gazing out from behind them. My reflection smiled, a slow, chilling smile that I hadn't intended, and in a voice that sounded almost like mine, I heard myself whisper, "It's okay, I'm here now." And in that moment, I knew that whatever had been waiting for me, whatever had been watching, it was inside now. It had taken its place, and I was the one left outside, a shadow in my own life, barely able to observe as this other me settled into my skin, learned my routines, spoke with my voice. Now I watch from somewhere deep, buried so far down I barely feel real. My body goes through the motions. My face wears my expressions. My hands sign my name. But it's not me anymore. It's something else, something that waited, that watched, and finally found a way in. And I know it's never going to let me out again. I'm not sure what you'll make of this story, but here it is, exactly as it happened. For the record, I'm not a superstitious person, and I don't scare easily. I work as an overnight groundskeeper at a local cemetery, a job that, believe it or not, was pretty calm and uneventful up until a few weeks ago. Usually I just lock up, walk the grounds, make sure there's no trouble, and maybe catch up on podcasts if things are slow. But now, I barely get through my shift without looking over my shoulder every 2 minutes. It started one cold, quiet night when I was making my rounds. I was halfway through a row of headstones when I noticed something strange, a grave that looked wrong. The dirt on top of it was disturbed, scattered as if someone had been digging around. At first, I thought it was just animals, maybe a stray dog or raccoon, but as I got closer, I realized that wasn't it. The soil looked like it had been churned up from beneath, like something was pushing up from the inside. I radioed my supervisor, Tom, and told him what I'd found. Tom's been working the cemetery circuit for nearly 20 years, and he's not exactly the type to scare easily either. But when I told him about the disturbed grave, he went silent for a second, then cleared his throat and said, "Just cover it up and keep going. Could be sinkholes with all this rain we've had." He told me he'd take a look in the morning. I didn't question it. Weird stuff happens at cemeteries, and sinkholes weren't exactly unheard of. So I did what he said, grabbed a shovel, evened out the dirt, and moved on. That night, though, I couldn't shake the image of that churned up grave. It felt wrong, but by the time I clocked out, I'd managed to brush it off as just a fluke, something I'd probably forget about in a day or two. And I did forget, at least for a while. Then a few nights later, it happened again. Same section of the cemetery. Another grave with soil churned up from below, like something was trying to push its way out. I started feeling a chill that went bone deep, even though I was bundled up in my winter coat. I had a flashlight, but it barely seemed to penetrate the dark around me. The air felt thick, almost hard to breathe. I radioed Tom again, and this time he sounded off. He asked which grave it was, and when I told him the section and the plot number, he went quiet, then muttered something about it happening again. Before I could ask what he meant, he just told me to cover it up like before and keep it to myself. I tried to sleep after my shift, but my dreams were filled with churning earth and shadowy figures rising from the ground. The next day, I did something I'd never done before. I looked up the records for that section of the cemetery. I know it's technically against policy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going on. I found a list of graves, each with a name, date of death, and a few notes. The grave I'd found first belonged to a man named James Corwin, buried in 1989. Cause of death, drowning. The second grave was a woman named Sylvia Tress, buried in 2003. Cause of death, unknown. Her file had an extra note beside it that just said investigation pending. Both graves were in the same row, only 2 plots apart. The more I read, the more my stomach twisted. It was like these 2 people had been buried and then forgotten, left in the back corner of the cemetery like a couple of unwanted memories. That night, I went in for my shift, nervous but trying not to show it. Everything was calm, just a cold breeze and the familiar quiet of the graveyard. But around midnight, I heard something, a low, rhythmic thudding sound. It was faint, almost like it was coming from far away, but it was there. At first, I thought it was just the wind rattling branches, but then I realized it was coming from the same section where I'd found the disturbed graves. I made my way over, flashlight in hand, and the closer I got, the louder the sound became. It wasn't the wind. It was a slow, steady knocking sound coming from underground. My heart was pounding as I stepped up to the grave, and sure enough, the soil was shifting again, little clumps of dirt tumbling down into a hollow that was forming. My instinct screamed at me to walk away, but I was frozen, watching as the ground pulsed, almost like it was breathing. I could feel my skin prickling with the cold, my breath hanging in the air. Then, just as I took a step back, the sound stopped. The air felt still, too still, like the whole cemetery was holding its breath. I told myself to leave, to walk away, and pretend I hadn't seen anything. But as I turned, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A hand reaching up from the soil. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't tell if I was seeing things, if my mind was just playing tricks on me in the dim light. But then the hand moved, slowly, weakly, but it moved, reaching up through the earth like it was trying to claw its way out. I stumbled back, heart hammering, and then did the only thing I could think of. I ran. I must have sprinted across half the cemetery before I reached the small security building by the gates. I burst inside, panting, feeling the cold sweat on my skin, and grabbed the phone, dialing Tom's number. When he answered, I told him what I'd seen, my words stumbling over each other. There was a pause. Then he sighed, long and low, like he'd been expecting it. "Listen," he said, his voice quiet. "There's something you should know about that section. It's one of the oldest parts of the cemetery, built over an older graveyard. The town never talks about it, but there were rumors about things not staying where they were buried." "What do you mean, things?" I asked, feeling a fresh wave of dread. "They say the dead weren't given proper burials back then," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "It was during a bad flu epidemic in the early 1900s. They buried people fast, and sometimes things got overlooked." He hung up after that, and I sat there, the silence pressing in around me. I didn't go back to that section that night. I didn't go near it the next night, either, or the night after that. But last week, during one of my shifts, I saw something strange. From across the cemetery, I caught sight of a figure standing right over the spot where I'd seen the hand. At first, I thought it was Tom or maybe a late-night visitor, but as I got closer, I realized there was something wrong. The figure didn't move, didn't shift, just stood there almost like it was waiting. I turned on my flashlight, but when the light hit the spot, the figure was gone. Just like that. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone. Now every night I feel it. That presence, that heavy silence hanging over the cemetery, like something's waiting just out of sight. Sometimes, as I walk the grounds, I hear the faint sound of knocking, a slow, steady thump coming from below. I'm writing this now because I don't think I can keep doing this job. Every shift, I feel like I'm one step closer to something I don't want to understand. I still see that hand in my dreams, reaching up through the soil, clawing, desperate. And every time I wake up, I feel that cold, suffocating silence, like a reminder that the dead don't always rest in peace. And the worst part? I know that whatever is out there, it's not done yet. The strangeness began the day after I brought the old mirror home. I'd found it at a small antique shop across town. The mirror was beautiful, with an ornate brass frame twisted into intricate floral patterns, almost like it was reaching toward you. It was a bit scratched and fogged, but it had character, and I thought it would look perfect in my living room. When I brought it back, I set it on the floor, leaning it against the wall for a moment before deciding where to hang it. I felt oddly reluctant to mount it on the wall, like something was telling me to just leave it alone. I told myself it was just nerves about the new purchase, shrugged it off, and left it propped up for the night. The first sign of something strange came that evening. I'd fallen asleep on the couch, and when I woke up, the mirror seemed to be angled slightly differently than how I'd left it. Instead of facing straight ahead, it was tilted just enough to catch the doorway behind me. I told myself I must have bumped it, adjusted it back, and didn't think much more of it. But the next night, the mirror moved again. This time, I found it leaning forward, almost like it was trying to tip over. I frowned, chalked it up to a loose frame, and decided I'd definitely hang it the next day. As I lifted it back to a standing position, my eyes caught something unusual in the glass, just a hint of motion. I turned around, but nothing was there. The room was empty, just as it had been. I glanced back into the mirror, and everything looked normal. I went to bed feeling a little uneasy, but told myself it was just nerves. I woke up around 3 a.m. to a strange, muffled sound coming from the living room. It was faint, like fabric shifting or someone walking softly on carpet. My stomach twisted, but I forced myself to get up and check. When I reached the doorway, I saw that the mirror was leaning forward again, almost tipping over. My pulse quickened. The mirror shouldn't have been able to move on its own, not at that angle. But there it was, leaning toward the floor as if something had pulled it forward. I set it upright, carefully this time, and went back to bed, though it took a long time for me to fall asleep. The next morning, I found something else that sent a chill through me. Smudged into the foggy glass were faint streaks, almost like fingerprints or smears, though I knew I hadn't touched it. I rubbed them away with a cloth, trying to calm myself down, and finally mounted the mirror on the wall. But the weirdness didn't stop. At night, I started hearing soft creaks and muffled sounds, all coming from the living room. It was never loud, but it was persistent, like something shifting back and forth, just enough to catch my attention. I tried to ignore it, but each night it seemed to get closer. Then one evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I glanced into the mirror. For a moment, I saw what I thought was a shadowy figure standing in the reflection, just behind me, peeking out from the edge of the frame. I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. When I turned back to the mirror, the figure was gone. I told myself I was just seeing things, but each night, the figure appeared more clearly. It was subtle, barely a form, like a haze in the shape of a person, always just at the edge of the glass, as if it was peeking in from another room. I avoided looking into the mirror after that, my skin crawling every time I passed it. But one night, the figure moved. I was brushing my teeth when I saw it shift, sliding from one edge of the mirror to the other, its head tilting as if watching me. I felt a stab of panic, dropped my toothbrush, and ran to the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I barely slept, heart racing, listening for the slightest sound. The next day, I covered the mirror with an old blanket, trying to shake the feeling that I'd made some horrible mistake. But even covered, the mirror seemed to cast a presence over the room, like something was watching from underneath the fabric. That night, I woke to a soft, rhythmic tapping. It was coming from the living room, a slow, deliberate sound like someone knocking. I lay in bed, paralyzed, clutching the blankets around me, hoping it would stop. But it didn't. The tapping grew louder, faster, until it was a steady beat like someone pounding on the wall. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw the blanket off, walked to the living room, and ripped the cover away from the mirror. For a moment, everything was silent. The glass was empty, just a reflection of me and the room behind me. I let out a shaky breath, feeling both foolish and relieved. But as I turned to walk away, I saw it. Out of the corner of my eye, a dark shape, looming in the background of the reflection. I looked back into the mirror, and there it was. A figure stood there, tall and shadowed. But this time it was closer. Close enough that I could almost make out its features. A face shrouded in darkness, eyes that seemed hollow, hungry. I stumbled back, but my reflection didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, its eyes locked onto mine, almost as if it were smiling. I ran out of the apartment that night, didn't even grab my keys. I spent the night at a friend's place, and the next day I called a moving company, deciding that I'd just leave the mirror behind, leave everything behind if I had to. I didn't care about the cost, I just needed to be gone. But when I came back to pack my things, I found the mirror had been moved. It was no longer on the wall, but lying flat on the floor, the glass shattered. My first thought was relief. that somehow it was over, that breaking the mirror had stopped whatever presence was lurking in it. Then I noticed something chilling in the shards. Written across each piece, in faint, foggy letters, were words, like someone had pressed their fingers into the glass from the other side. Together, the shards formed a single sentence. "I'll see you soon." I left that day and never looked back. I moved to a new city, cut contact with everyone who knew my address, changed my number. But sometimes, even now, I catch my reflection lingering just a second too long, the hint of a shadow in the glass, as though something is watching me, waiting for the right moment to come through. It started when I found the photographs. I was digging through an old shoebox, looking for my passport, which I'd misplaced for the 100th time. Among the expired IDs and mismatched socks, I found a small stack of Polaroids that I didn't remember taking. The photos were of my apartment, each one capturing a different room, all from strange angles. The living room from the perspective of someone crouching by the door, the kitchen shot from beneath the countertop, the hallway taken low to the ground as if snapped in secret. I stared at them for a long time, my mind racing for a rational explanation. Maybe I'd been experimenting with my old Polaroid camera and forgotten. Maybe they were taken during some late-night creative binge. But as I flipped through the stack, my stomach churned because I realized something unsettling. The photos captured details that didn't match my apartment as it was now. In one of the photos, my living room wall was missing the painting I'd bought a few months back. Another showed my kitchen with an old toaster I'd thrown out years ago. And in one, the most chilling one, my bed had a bright red quilt folded neatly at the foot, a quilt I'd never seen before in my life. I told myself it had to be a joke. Someone had found old photos of my apartment and decided to mess with me. Maybe a friend who still had a spare key from years back. But there was a creeping feeling I couldn't shake, a feeling that these photos weren't just old. They were capturing moments from different versions of my life, details that hadn't existed together, like a fractured memory merging pieces from different times. I shoved the photos back into the shoebox and tried to put them out of my mind. But after that day, things began to shift around me. The changes were subtle at first. I'd come home from work and find the pillows on my couch arranged differently, or my coffee mug moved from the counter to the sink. Once I noticed the hallway rug looked longer, somehow stretching farther down than I remembered. And then, one evening, I unlocked my front door and stepped inside, only to find myself facing the wrong room. Instead of my entryway, I was looking into my bedroom. For a second, I stood there confused, thinking I'd somehow walked into the wrong apartment. But it was definitely mine. Same creaky floorboards, same faded green walls. I took a few steps forward, and the layout shifted back to normal, the bedroom vanishing as the familiar hallway appeared before me. I chalked it up to exhaustion, a trick of my eyes, but the unease in my chest lingered. A few nights later, I was in the bathroom brushing my teeth when I saw something strange in the mirror. At first, I thought it was just a smudge on the glass, a faint shape hovering near the edge. But as I leaned closer, I saw that it was a face, my face but off. Her expression was cold, eyes narrowed, as if she were examining me with detached curiosity. I stared frozen, and she didn't move. I glanced over my shoulder, heart racing, but there was nothing behind me. When I looked back at the mirror, my reflection was normal, the ghostly figure gone. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that my apartment was watching me. Sometimes when I walked into a room, I'd get a flash of déjà vu like I'd been there before, but things were slightly out of place. Furniture an inch to the left, a light switch in the wrong spot. It felt like I was stepping into alternate versions of my own life, brief snapshots of realities where everything was almost the same, but not quite. One evening, in a fit of frustration, I grabbed the Polaroid camera that had been gathering dust on my bookshelf. I didn't know what I was hoping to capture, but I needed some kind of proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I took a picture of the living room, waited for the film to develop, and when I looked at the image, my heart sank. The photo showed my living room exactly as it was, except for one detail. There was a figure standing in the corner, half shrouded in shadow. She was facing away from me, her head tilted slightly to the side, as if listening to something only she could hear. She had my same build, wore my clothes, but I knew without a doubt it wasn't me. My hands shook as I took another photo, this time of the hallway, and again, the same figure appeared, closer now, her back still turned. I spent the next hour snapping photos of every room in the apartment, and every single one showed the same figure, getting closer and closer with each picture. In the final photo, she was standing just inches from the camera, her face partially visible, an eerie half-smile twisting her lips. Her eyes were dark, hollow, staring directly into the lens. Panicked, I threw the Polaroids into a drawer and slammed it shut. But the feeling of being watched only intensified. Shadows lingered in the corners of my vision, vanishing whenever I turned my head. I'd hear faint footsteps at night, soft but unmistakable, pacing outside my bedroom door. One night, I awoke to the sound of whispering, a voice barely audible, repeating my name over and over. I lay there, paralyzed, listening to my own name echo through the dark. A week later, I was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels to distract myself, when the TV screen froze. Static crackled, and an image slowly faded in. It was my apartment, but the angle was all wrong, like it was being filmed from somewhere just above me watching. The camera slowly panned across the living room and settled on the couch, where I was sitting, watching myself watch the TV. My own face stared back at me, wide-eyed, caught in the act of observing myself. I scrambled to turn off the TV, but the image persisted, my face slowly twisting into that same eerie half-smile I'd seen in the Polaroids. "Hello," the figure on the screen mouthed silently, her lips forming the word without sound. And then, without warning, she got up from the couch on the screen and walked toward the camera, her eyes fixed on mine. She pressed her face up close, filling the screen, her smile widening, her hand reaching toward me through the glass. I ripped the power cord out of the wall, plunging the room into silence. My own reflection on the blank TV screen stared back at me, looking perfectly normal, but for the faintest hint of that twisted smile lingering at the corners of my mouth. That was the night I decided to leave. I packed a bag with the essentials, grabbed my keys, and rushed out the door, not daring to look back. I went to a hotel across town, certain that once I put some distance between myself and that apartment, everything would return to normal. But the next morning, when I stepped out of the hotel room, I was back in my apartment building's hallway. I tried leaving a dozen more times. I'd take different routes, try different exits, even hitch rides to other parts of the city. But every time I turned a corner, opened a door, or looked up, I was back in that building, back in front of my apartment. It was as if the building itself wouldn't let me leave, no matter how far I tried to go. And now, I think I'm no longer alone. At night, I see her pacing the rooms, the other me, her shadow moving just beyond my reach. She sits at the kitchen table when I'm trying to sleep, her fingers tapping rhythmically on the surface, as if waiting for me to join her. Sometimes, I feel her breathing just behind me, her hand brushing my shoulder, cold and unmistakable. One night, I tried confronting her. I turned to the darkness where I knew she was standing and shouted, "What do you want?" Her voice echoed back, soft and distant, like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "I want what's mine." I haven't seen her since that night, but I know she's here. The shadows are thicker, lingering at the edges of my vision. I hear her voice sometimes, in my own mind, whispering memories that don't belong to me, dreams that feel like someone else's life. I'm not sure how much longer I'll last here. Sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I see her staring back, her half-smile twisting into something that no longer feels familiar. I think she's waiting for me to give in, to let her slip into place, and once she does, there won't be anything left of me. And maybe, just maybe, that was the plan all along. My wife, Liza, loved yard sales, and her latest find was an old Polaroid camera she'd picked up from an estate sale in a nearby town. She was thrilled about it, and I admit there was something charming about the heavy, clunky camera and the instant photos it spat out. We'd never owned one like it, and we spent that first night snapping pictures of each other in our living room, laughing as each image faded into view. There was something nostalgic and oddly magical about it, like the camera captured not just images but little pieces of memory. It started out simple. The next day, I took it outside to try and photograph the lake behind our house. It was early, and the fog was just lifting, casting a soft, eerie light over the water. I took a shot and watched as the picture slowly developed in my hands. But as the fog faded and the details became clear, something didn't look right. In the photo, just to the left of the dock, was a figure. It looked like a person, standing there in the mist, their face blurred, as if they were just emerging from the water. I looked up, scanning the dock, the lake, the trees around me, but no one was there. My eyes drifted back to the Polaroid, and a chill ran through me. The figure seemed faint, like a shadow or a trick of the light. I tried to laugh it off, deciding it was just an artifact of the fog, or maybe even a double exposure. But later that night, as Liza and I sat together on the couch looking through our day's photos, she noticed it too. Her expression changed, and she held the picture up to the light, squinting at the faint figure on the dock. "Who's that?" she asked, her voice tight with concern. "No one," I said quickly. "It's probably just the fog or something." She didn't look convinced, but she set it aside, moving on to the other photos we'd taken. I could tell she was still thinking about it, though. I was too. The next day, I took the camera out again, snapping pictures around the property, a shot of the old oak tree out front, another of our swing set, the garden, the shed. Each time, as I waited for the image to develop, I felt a strange tension, like something was lurking just outside the frame. I didn't know what I expected to see, but each photo was normal, just ordinary shots of our yard. Then I took one of the house. I held the Polaroid in my hands as it faded in, the familiar shape of our home coming into focus. But as the image cleared, my heart stopped. There was a figure standing in the upstairs window, our bedroom window. It was blurry, indistinct, but I could tell it was the same shadowy figure from the lake photo. This time, I felt a deep sense of dread. I stared at the picture, trying to make sense of it, telling myself it had to be a flaw in the film or the camera. I knew that Polaroids could sometimes capture strange light anomalies, but there was something deliberate about the shape in the window. It looked like someone was watching me, their face just barely visible, a dark smear of eyes and a mouth twisted in a half-smile. I took the picture inside and showed Liza. She went pale, clutching the photo with a shaking hand. "We were both downstairs," she whispered, her eyes flicking toward the staircase, as if expecting someone to come down. "That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay there in the dark, listening to every creak and groan of the house, half convinced that I'd hear footsteps above or see that figure in the doorway. But the night passed quietly, and by morning, I'd managed to convince myself it was just my imagination. Liza, though, was more curious than frightened. She spent the next few days snapping pictures of every room, hoping to catch the figure again, as if she could turn it into some kind of mystery to solve. Each picture was ordinary, empty rooms filled with nothing but furniture and sunlight. After a while, she laughed it off, saying the camera was just quirky and prone to glitches. But one night, as we were getting ready for bed, I heard her gasp from the living room. I rushed in to see her standing by the coffee table, holding a new photo. She looked up at me, eyes wide with fear. "It's in here," she whispered, holding up the Polaroid. I took the photo from her, my stomach knotting. It was a picture she'd taken just that afternoon of our living room, the room we were standing in right now. And there, by the fireplace, was the figure again, clearer this time. The face was still obscured, but I could see the outline of its head and shoulders, almost as if it had been crouched watching. It felt like it was looking right at us. We tried to brush it off, but neither of us slept that night. The next morning, I decided to test the camera one last time, convinced I'd somehow prove to myself it was broken or haunted by nothing more than light leaks. I took it to the basement, where we rarely went, and snapped a photo of the old wooden shelves stacked with dusty boxes and tools. The picture took longer to develop this time, or maybe I was just too anxious. My breath held as I waited for it to come into focus. But when the image finally cleared, I nearly dropped it. There was a face in the photo, not a shadowy blur or a trick of the light, but a distinct, grinning face peering out from between the boxes on the shelf. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, and its mouth stretched into an unnatural smile. I recognized it immediately. It looked like Liza, but something was terribly wrong. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale and taut, and that smile. I'd never seen her smile like that. Panicking, I ran back upstairs, calling for her, hoping she was still there. She was in the kitchen, making breakfast, looking at me with confusion and concern. I clutched the photo, showing it to her, pointing out the horrifying face in the basement. She looked down at it, her eyes flicking between the picture and me. Her brow furrowed, and then she said in a strange, calm voice, "That's not me." I stared at her, at the face in the picture, and then back at her, feeling a creeping sense of dread claw up my spine. She was right. Something about the face in the picture was off, twisted in a way that didn't match her. But it wasn't just that. It was the look in her eyes, this slight flicker of recognition. That night, Liza insisted on taking more photos, even though I was ready to throw the camera out. She said we needed to figure out what was happening, that maybe the camera was showing us something we needed to see. She spoke with a strange intensity, her gaze fixated on the Polaroids as if they held some secret only she could decipher. We took a few more pictures, snapping shots of the living room, the hallway, the stairs. In each one, the figure was closer, clearer, moving through the house as if drawing nearer to us. In one, it stood in the kitchen doorway. In the next, it was in the hallway, its face half turned, that awful smile stretching wider. Finally, in a photo we took of our bedroom, it was there. The figure was leaning over our bed, staring down at the pillows with an expression of pure malice. I felt a wave of nausea as I realized the implications. Whatever was in these photos was in our home, moving through it as if it had a will of its own. That night, Liza was restless, pacing the house with the camera, snapping photos at every turn. I followed her, trying to convince her to stop, but she wouldn't listen. Her face was flushed, her eyes bright with some feverish intensity one didn't recognize. She kept muttering, saying things like, "It's trying to tell us something," and "We have to know." In one final desperate attempt, I grabbed the camera from her and snapped a picture of us, standing together in the hallway. I held it as it developed, my hands shaking, feeling like I was holding a bomb about to go off. When the image finally became clear, my heart dropped. In the photo, I was standing alone, but where Liza should have been, there was only the figure, grinning up at me with that twisted, mocking smile. I looked up from the photo, my mouth dry, and realized that the hallway was empty. Liza was gone. I searched every inch of the house, calling her name, but she was nowhere to be found. The only trace she'd left behind was the camera, lying on the floor, and that last, awful photograph in my hand. To this day, I don't know where she went, or if she ever left at all. Sometimes, when the house is quiet, I hear footsteps, the faint click of the camera, and find new photos left on the table. In each one, the figure is a little clearer, a little closer, and each time it looks a little more like her. About 5 years ago, I went on a hiking trip with my younger sister, Leah, in the Appalachian Mountains. She just turned 18 and was dying for a little adventure before starting college, so I agreed to go along. We packed light, planned to camp one night, and mapped out a trail that was considered easy enough for a 2-day trip, but remote enough to feel like an escape from the world. It was late fall, with the leaves a patchwork of orange and red, and we only saw a few hikers on our way in. By the time the sun started setting, we'd made it to a small clearing beside a creek and set up our tent. We made a small fire, ate our snacks, and told some ridiculous stories, just the two of us laughing as it got darker around us. The air was crisp, and all we could hear were the sounds of the forest, a comforting quietness. At around 10 p.m., we put out the fire, crawled into the tent, and passed out almost instantly. But sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to a strange sound. It was faint but rhythmic, like a slow, steady scraping. I sat up, listening closely. Leah was asleep beside me, oblivious. The sound was coming from somewhere outside the tent, too close for comfort, like someone was dragging something sharp along the forest floor. I held my breath, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. It was too precise to be an animal. I listened for a while, and just as I was starting to convince myself it was nothing, Leah stirred beside me. "You hear that?" she whispered, wide awake now. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if she could see me in the dark. "I don't know what it is," she whispered. "Maybe it's a deer or something?" We stayed silent, waiting, but the sound grew louder, closer. The steady scraping turned to what sounded like footsteps crunching over leaves, moving slowly, almost deliberately. Leah's grip tightened on my arm. Then just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. We waited, straining to hear anything else, but there was nothing. Just the eerie silence of the woods at night. I told myself it must have been an animal, maybe even the wind. Eventually, we drifted back to sleep, though it took me a while to shake the feeling of unease. The next morning, we packed up our things and got back on the trail, both of us eager to get moving. We didn't talk much about the sounds from the night before, but it lingered in the back of my mind. After a couple of hours, we passed by another hiker, an older man who looked like he'd been out there for days. His face was weathered, and his clothes were layered in that way people who live in the woods dress. He gave us a nod as he passed, and I felt a strange sense of relief seeing another person out there. But about an hour later, I noticed something odd. On the path ahead of us, just off to the side, were a few objects: a half-buried boot, an old, rusty hunting knife, and a small, cracked mirror. They looked as though they'd been there for a long time, abandoned. Leah noticed them too, slowing her steps, her face creasing with confusion. "Think someone lost their stuff?" she asked. "Maybe," I said, though something about the way the items were laid out felt deliberate, almost like they'd been placed there on purpose. As we continued, we saw more things strewn along the path. A broken compass, an empty canteen, an old map with pieces torn out. Each item looked like it had belonged to someone, each one personal and weathered with time. Leah and I exchanged glances, uneasy now. It was like a trail of breadcrumbs, each item hinting at someone who'd come before us and never returned. After a couple more miles, we came to a fork in the trail where a crude wooden sign was nailed to a tree. It had the word "lost" carved into it, the letters uneven and jagged, as though they'd been scraped in with a knife. Below it, there was a piece of cloth tied around the tree, stained and frayed, fluttering slightly in the breeze. I felt a prickle of fear creeping up my spine. The sign looked recent, too recent. "Maybe we should head back," Leah suggested, her voice tense. I didn't argue. Something about this place felt wrong, like we were intruding on something we weren't supposed to see. We turned around and started retracing our steps, picking up the pace. But as we hiked back, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustling leaf, every snapping twig seemed amplified, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. After what felt like hours, we reached the area where we'd camped the night before. But when we got there, we noticed something that stopped us in our tracks. Lying in the middle of the clearing was a small, folded piece of paper, weighted down with a stone. It hadn't been there when we'd packed up in the morning. I was sure of it. I knelt down, picked it up, and unfolded it. Inside, scrawled in shaky handwriting, were the words, "You're not alone." My blood ran cold. Leah looked over my shoulder, her face draining of color. We didn't wait to figure out what it meant. We started hiking faster, practically running down the trail. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following us. But the path behind us was always empty, quiet, as if the forest itself was swallowing any sound. We were only a mile or so from the trailhead when we saw him again, the man we'd passed earlier. He was sitting on a rock off to the side of the path, watching us with an expression I couldn't read. He didn't say anything as we passed, just nodded slightly, as if he'd been expecting us. Once we were finally back in the parking lot, Leah and I practically collapsed into my car. I locked the doors immediately, feeling a rush of relief. We sat there for a few minutes, catching our breath, and I glanced back at the trailhead, half expecting to see someone step out from the trees. But there was no one there, just the empty path leading back into the dense woods. We didn't talk much on the drive back. The only thing Leah said was, "You don't think that guy?" She didn't finish the sentence, and I didn't respond. But the thought had crossed my mind too. Maybe he was just another hiker, or maybe he'd been the one leaving those things, marking the trail. Maybe he'd left the note, watching us all along. I haven't gone hiking since. I keep telling myself it was just my imagination, that it was just one of those creepy coincidences. But sometimes, late at night, I'll remember that note, the strange items, the man on the trail. And I wonder if there are other people out there who've come across similar trails, similar signs. I wonder if anyone else found a note like ours. And sometimes I wonder if they made it back. I met Elle the day after I moved into my new apartment, a narrow but bright one-bedroom in an old building on the city's quieter edge. It was the sort of place that creaked and rattled, with the occasional mouse running through the walls. The charm was there if you squinted. I wanted a change, something less predictable, and this felt like the kind of spot where anything could happen. The first time I saw her, I was struggling to unlock my door with an armful of groceries. She was coming down the hall, moving quietly, her footsteps almost soundless on the old carpet. She looked to be in her 40s, tall, with short, platinum blonde hair and large, round glasses that hid most of her face. She had this effortless grace, her dark clothes and sharp profile making her look like she belonged in an art gallery. As I finally got the door open, I felt her watching me. "You're new here," she said, her voice low and even. I nodded, a little surprised by her directness. "Yeah, just moved in yesterday. I'm Violet." She tilted her head, observing me carefully. "Welcome, Violet. Amel, let me know if you need anything." Her tone was polite, but something about the way she held my gaze felt unnerving, like she was assessing me, filing away details. "Thanks, I appreciate it," I replied, offering a polite smile. She gave a faint smile back, but it was tight, not quite reaching her eyes. The next few days, I saw her now and then in the hallways, always at odd times. Late at night when I'd go to get something from my car, or early in the morning when I was leaving for work. She'd appear out of nowhere, and each time she'd stop and watch me, giving that same faint smile before disappearing around the corner. I shrugged it off as just a quirky neighbor thing. Then one night, I was trying to sleep when I heard footsteps outside my door. It was around 2 a.m., and the sound was soft, deliberate, like someone was pacing back and forth. I lay there, my heart pounding, straining to listen. After a few minutes, the footsteps stopped, and I heard a quiet, almost rhythmic tapping, like someone was gently knocking on the door next to mine, Elle's apartment. The next morning, I ran into her in the hall as I was leaving for work. She gave me that same strange smile, but this time, her eyes seemed distant, unfocused. "Did you hear anything weird last night?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. She blinked, then shrugged. "This building has a mind of its own. You get used to the sounds." Her lips twitched into that same, tight-lipped smile, and then she turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, feeling oddly dismissed. Over the next week, strange things started happening. Little things easy to ignore at first. My keys would go missing, only to reappear in strange places like under my pillow or in the freezer. Once, I came home to find the living room window wide open, though I was sure I'd closed it. Each time, I'd find Elle standing somewhere nearby, watching quietly. She'd tilt her head, that faint smile on her lips, as if she knew something I didn't. One afternoon, as I was coming up the stairs, I found a small, white envelope taped to my door. My name was written on it in careful, slanted handwriting, but there was no return address or anything to indicate who it was from. Inside was a single note, written in the same handwriting. "Be careful who you trust." I stared at the note, a shiver running down my spine. There was no one in the hallway, but as I closed my door, I had the feeling that someone was listening just beyond the walls. That night, I stayed up late, half watching TV and trying to shake off the unsettling feeling that had settled over me. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again, that same soft, slow pace outside my door. This time, though, they didn't stop at Elle's apartment. Instead, they paused right outside my door. I held my breath, heart pounding, listening as the footsteps moved away, fading down the hall. I felt a mix of dread and curiosity, wondering if I was just being paranoid. After a while, I convinced myself it was probably just someone coming back late, maybe a neighbor with insomnia. But then, around 2 a.m., I was jolted awake by a soft knock on my door. It was so faint, almost hesitant, like whoever was knocking didn't want to wake anyone else. I lay there, heart racing, too afraid to move. The knock came again, a little louder this time. I slowly got out of bed, tiptoeing to the door. I pressed my eye to the peephole, half expecting to see Elle, but the hallway was empty. The next morning, I felt on edge, jittery, like I'd slept through an alarm. I went to the landlord's office and mentioned the strange sounds in the hallway, hinting that maybe someone had been trying to get into my apartment. "Ah, you're next to Elle's place, aren't you?" the landlord asked, giving me a strange look. I nodded, not sure where he was going with this. He lowered his voice, leaning in. "She's had a rough time. Used to live here with her husband, but he disappeared about a year ago. No one knows what happened, but she's been different ever since. Keeps to herself, mostly, but she's harmless." The way he said harmless sounded uncertain, like he wasn't quite sure if he believed it himself. That night, as I was brushing my teeth, I heard the footsteps again, that same deliberate, soft pacing outside my door. I froze, toothbrush in hand, listening as they stopped just outside. Then, in the silence, I heard a quiet whisper, so faint I almost thought I'd imagined it. "Don't trust anyone." The words lingered, filling the room with a strange chill. I opened the door a crack, my heart pounding, but the hallway was empty, just shadows stretching across the carpet. Over the next few days, Elle's behavior grew even stranger. I'd catch her standing outside my door in the early mornings, her gaze unfocused, her mouth moving like she was talking to herself. Once, I even found her in the laundry room, staring at the wall, muttering something I couldn't make out. One evening, I was heading out to grab groceries when I found another note taped to my door, written in that same careful handwriting. The walls remember everything. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the faintest sound, a whisper coming from the wall behind my bed. It was so soft, so low, that I had to press my ear to the wall to hear it clearly. But there was unmistakable, a quiet, rhythmic chanting like someone repeating the same words over and over. The next morning, I'd had enough. I decided to confront Elle, to ask her what was going on, to see if she was the one behind the notes and the noises. I knocked on her door, waiting, heart pounding, but there was no answer. After a few minutes, I tried the handle, finding it unlocked. I stepped inside, calling her name, but the apartment was empty. The walls were bare, the furniture sparse, like no one had lived there in years. But as I walked through, I noticed something strange. Notes, dozens of them, pinned to the walls. Each one was written in that same careful handwriting. "Don't let them in. Trust no one. They know you're here." I backed out of the apartment, my heart racing, feeling like I'd stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to see. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard the footsteps again, but this time they didn't stop. They kept moving, pacing back and forth, faster and faster, until they sounded like a frantic, panicked rhythm echoing through the hallway. The next morning, Elle's apartment was empty. The landlord said she'd moved out in the night, leaving no forwarding address. I never saw her again, but sometimes in the middle of the night, I still hear the footsteps, pacing outside my door, as if she's still there, trapped in some endless loop, warning me from beyond the wall. A few years ago, I took an overnight train to visit a friend in a different city. It was one of those red-eye rides where most of the passengers settle into a heavy silence, the cars swaying gently on the tracks, the lights dim to an almost eerie glow. I'd chosen a sleeper cabin, thinking it'd be a peaceful journey, maybe even a bit of an adventure. But that night, well, it became something I can't quite explain. It started out as any train ride does, me, curled up with a book, watching the darkened countryside blur past the window. There was the faint sound of snoring from nearby cabins, a baby crying in the distance, all normal travel noise. But around midnight, the train jolted, a sudden, violent lurch that woke up several other passengers in the cabins nearby. I glanced out, expecting to see us passing through a storm or a rough stretch of track, but the night outside was clear and calm, with a full moon casting pale light over the landscape. I shrugged it off, closed my eyes, and tried to drift back to sleep. But sleep wasn't coming easily. Every time I started to doze, I'd hear it, an odd, low hum, almost like a distant engine but slower, pulsing in and out, vibrating through the cabin walls. I figured it was just part of the train mechanics, but there was something strange about it, something that made my stomach twist with an unease I couldn't quite shake. Then, just as I was drifting off for real, I heard footsteps in the narrow hallway outside my cabin. They were slow, steady, as if someone was walking back and forth. I waited, thinking it was just a passenger stretching their legs, but the footsteps didn't stop. They kept pacing up and down a slow, heavy stride that felt off. Unnatural. I pressed my ear to the cabin door, straining to listen, but the footsteps abruptly stopped right outside. My heart raced as I held my breath, waiting, listening, my hand reaching slowly toward the door lock. I don't know what made me do it, but I looked through the peephole, and there, standing just inches from my door, was a figure cloaked in shadow, their face hidden under the brim of an old, wide-brimmed hat. The figure stood there, unmoving, as if listening for something. I could only see part of their face, a thin, pale chin, lips set in a straight line. The rest was shrouded, hidden under that hat and shadow. The sight of them sent chills down my spine, and I backed away from the door as quietly as I could, hoping they'd just leave. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps started again, slowly moving down the hallway. I waited, hardly daring to breathe, until the sounds faded away. I lay there, tense, trying to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. I kept telling myself it was just a fellow passenger, maybe someone who couldn't sleep. But then the train lurched again, harder this time, making me grip the edge of the bunk to keep from falling out. The lights flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows across the cabin. I thought about calling a conductor, but something told me not to, as if speaking out loud would somehow make everything worse. Minutes later, I heard the footsteps again, closer this time. They moved slowly down the hall, one heavy step after another, stopping outside each door. There was a faint tapping sound, like fingernails lightly scratching each door in turn, as if checking for what? Someone awake? Someone listening? I clamped my hand over my mouth, pressing myself against the wall, my heart racing so loud I was sure it could be heard outside. The footsteps moved past my door again, continuing down the hall, fading into silence once more. I didn't dare move for a long time, just sat there in the dark, waiting for, I didn't know what. Hours passed. I must have drifted off eventually, but when I woke, the train was dead silent. No rattling on the tracks, no hum of the engine. I checked my phone for the time, but it was dead, drained somehow. I pressed my ear to the door again, but all I heard was the soft, deep quiet of an unmoving train. Curiosity and dread were at war inside me, but I had to know what was going on. I slowly opened my door, peeking out into the dimly lit hallway. Every door in the corridor was shut, the lights flickering on and off in strange intervals, casting long shadows down the empty aisle. I stepped out, trying to keep my footsteps silent, looking for anyone, passengers, conductors, anyone who could explain why we'd stopped. As I reached the end of the hallway, I saw that the door to the next car was open, slightly ajar. I crept toward it, pushing it open just enough to see inside. The car was empty, every seat vacant, save for one. And there, sitting perfectly still, with their hands folded neatly on their lap, was the same shadowed figure from the hallway. They didn't turn, didn't react. They just sat there, facing forward, as if waiting for something. I couldn't see their face, only the faint outline under the brim of that wide-brimmed hat. Against every instinct, I felt my feet moving forward, as if something was pulling me closer, step by step. I was almost to the seat when the figure finally turned, slowly, like they'd been waiting all along. I caught a glimpse of their face, pale, expressionless, eyes staring right through me with an intensity that made my blood run cold. Then they leaned forward, whispering in a voice so low I could barely hear it. But the words, they felt like they were pressing directly into my mind. "You should be asleep." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet, and bolted for the door, slamming it shut behind me. My heart pounded as I ran back to my cabin, locking the door and huddling in the corner, trying to shake the feeling that they were somehow just on the other side waiting. The train jolted to life, the hum of the engine filling the silence as we started moving again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, just sat there, watching the door, waiting for any sound, any movement. But the footsteps didn't come again, and by the time dawn broke, the train pulled into the station like nothing had happened. When I stepped off the train, exhausted and bleary-eyed, I tried to tell myself it was just a strange dream, that maybe I'd dozed off and imagined the whole thing. But as I turned back to look at the train one last time, I saw a face in one of the windows, hidden beneath the brim of an old, wide-brimmed hat, watching as I walked away. I don't know what I expected when I started the night shift as a security guard for the Ridgeway storage facility. It was a boring job. Honestly, a giant windowless building with endless rows of storage units. The manager, Steve, was this laid-back guy in his 50s who trained me by saying, just walk the place every couple of hours, make sure no one's breaking in. Easy stuff. Then he handed me a flashlight and a cheap walkie-talkie and left me to it. The first few nights were quiet, just me and the hum of the overhead lights. The units were all locked, the hallways silent, save for the occasional drip of a leaky pipe or the scurry of something small darting across the floor. I'd walk my rounds, double-checking the locks, glancing over the doors, making sure everything looked undisturbed. And that was it. It was almost peaceful in a way. Then, one night, I found a door slightly open. It was Unit 237, a nondescript metal door with a small, round padlock dangling from the latch. It looked intact, but the door had been left just a crack open, like someone had forgotten to pull it shut. I figured it was no big deal, just a mistake or maybe some renter who hadn't latched it properly. But when I pushed it open, what I found inside didn't make any sense. The walls were covered in mirrors, floor-to-ceiling mirrors, each one reflecting my flashlight beam back at me from every angle. There were at least 20 of them, arranged in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. I could see myself in all of them, dozens of versions of myself staring back, wide-eyed and confused. In the center of the room, on a small wooden stool, sat an old-fashioned tape recorder. The recorder was already running, the reel spinning slowly, the faint hiss of static filling the room. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stepped closer, leaning in to listen. A low, crackling voice came through the tape. It sounded familiar. I strained to make out the words, feeling my skin prickle as I realized it was saying my name, over and over, in a slow, raspy whisper. Evan, Evan, you shouldn't have come here. The voice sent a chill straight down my spine, like it was speaking directly to me from somewhere, just beyond the mirrors. I backed out of the unit, my heart racing. I locked the door and spent the rest of the night pacing around the lobby, telling myself it was just someone's weird prank, that maybe someone else on the night shift before me had been messing around. When Steve came in the next morning, I told him what I'd seen, half expecting him to laugh or call me crazy. Instead, he gave me this look almost pitying and said, just ignore it. Some units, they're better left alone. I thought about quitting, but something pulled me back. The next night, I went back to Unit 237. The door was shut and locked, just as I'd left it. I half expected the mirrors and the tape recorder to be gone, like I'd imagined the whole thing. But when I unlocked the door, there it all was, the mirrors, the stool, the tape recorder sitting in the middle, as if it were waiting for me. This time, the tape had stopped. I leaned in, pressing the play button again, and waited as the tape clicked in word. Static filled the air, punctuated by that same familiar voice, low and crackling. Evan, it's your turn. The words sent a jolt through me, like the voice knew me better than I knew myself. And then, as I listened, a sound emerged from the background. A faint, steady tap, like someone knocking on glass. I glanced around the room, my flashlight beam bouncing from mirror to mirror. But there was nothing there, just my own pale face staring back, reflected 100 times over. I told myself it was my imagination, that it was just the echoes of the building. But then the knocking grew louder, more insistent, as if it were coming from behind the mirrors themselves. I bolted out of there, slamming the door shut, my hands shaking as I latched the lock. But even as I walked away, I could still hear the faint knocking, echoing through the metal door like whatever was inside was trying to get out. The next night, I almost didn't show up, but something kept nagging at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was supposed to be there, that there was something I needed to understand. So I went back, flashlight in hand, heart pounding, and did my rounds like usual. Around 2 a.m., I heard the knocking again, but this time it wasn't coming from Unit 237. It was coming from the far end of the hallway, near a row of units I'd barely noticed before. These doors were older, rusted, almost hidden in the dim light, like they were part of a section of the building that hadn't been used in years. I walked toward the sound, feeling that familiar chill prickling at the back of my neck. The knocking grew louder, more urgent, and as I got closer, I realized it was coming from Unit 301, a unit I was sure hadn't been on my list. I checked my clipboard, but there was no record of it. I shouldn't have even been able to open it. But the door wasn't locked. I pushed it open, and the smell hit me immediately. A cold, stale air, like a place that had been shut off from the world for decades. The room was empty, save for a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, flickering faintly. I stepped inside, shining my flashlight around, feeling like I was stepping into some kind of forgotten part of reality. And then, without warning, the door slammed shut behind me. The light bulb went out, leaving me in total darkness. I fumbled for the door handle, twisting and pulling, but it wouldn't budge. Panic clawed at my throat as I realized I was trapped, alone in the pitch-black room. And then, just as I was about to start screaming, I heard it, the faint hum of a tape recorder whirring to life. A soft, raspy voice filled the air, that same voice from before, but this time, it wasn't saying my name. It was laughing, a low, hollow sound that echoed off the walls, filling every inch of the cramped, dark space. "Do you know why you're here?" it whispered, the voice coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. "You're not the first. You won't be the last." I pounded on the door, my flashlight beam flickering as I fought to stay calm. "Let me out!" I shouted, my voice sounding small and desperate in the empty space. But the voice just laughed, the sound growing louder, until it was all I could hear, pressing in on me from all sides. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the laughter stopped. The silence was thick, suffocating, and in the darkness, I could just make out a faint outline in front of me. I raised my flashlight, hands shaking, and saw myself. It was me, standing there, staring back, my face twisted into a wide, unnatural grin. My eyes were empty, hollow, like they'd been carved out of wax. My other self lifted a hand, tapping gently on the glass, separating us, as if it were trapped on the other side. And then it leaned in close, its voice a low, mocking whisper that cut through the darkness. "Your shift's just beginning." The light flickered back on, and the door swung open behind me. I stumbled out, gasping, half expecting someone to be standing there. But the hallway was empty, the only sound my own ragged breathing echoing off the walls. When Steve showed up in the morning, I handed him my badge without a word. He didn't ask why I was quitting, didn't even look surprised. He just nodded, that same pitying look in his eyes, and said, "Sometimes the place gets a hold of you. Be glad you got out." I left Ridgeway Storage that morning, but sometimes late at night, I still hear it, the faint, steady tapping like someone knocking on glass, waiting to be let out. And every time, a part of me wonders if I really did get out, or if I'm still there, just another reflection in one of those endless rows of mirrors, waiting for the next poor soul to wander in. It started as an ordinary day, just me and Nina lounging on the couch, her reading a novel while I scrolled mindlessly through my phone. The easy silence felt like home. I'd known Nina since college. She'd swept into my life with her wild laugh and these big, adventurous plans. Over the years, we'd built a quiet life together, one I was proud of, even though it wasn't the thrill-seeking dream we'd once talked about. I thought we were solid, unshakable. Looking back, I can pinpoint when things started shifting, but at the time, it all felt so vague, so subtle. The first sign was how Nina started bringing up her coworker, Ben, in conversations, just little things like how he cracked a joke in a meeting or helped her with some project. I didn't think much of it. We both had friends at work. But after a while, her stories about him became more frequent. They'd gone for a coffee once, then again, and then a few more times. I told myself it was nothing. She'd always been sociable. But a sliver of unease crept in, small but persistent. One night, she was in the kitchen on her phone, laughing in that way that she usually reserved for me, her face lighting up as she read a message. When she noticed me watching, she abruptly stopped, tucking the phone in her pocket. I felt a pang, but didn't say anything. We'd never been the type to pry or question each other. I convinced myself that whatever I was feeling was just insecurity, but insecurities have a way of growing. It wasn't long before I noticed other changes. She'd stay late at work more often, and her smile, usually warm and inviting, felt distant, almost guarded. She was glued to her phone, always typing with a little smirk or worse, a blush. And when I asked about her day, her answers were shorter, with fewer of the details she used to eagerly share. I felt like a stranger in my own relationship. Then, one Friday evening, she told me she was going to a team-building event that would run late. I decided to surprise her afterward with her favorite snacks, thinking we'd end the night laughing and talking like old times. I showed up at her office around 9 p.m., expecting to see her laughing with her coworkers. Instead, the place was dark, parking lot almost empty. Confused, I walked up to the building, half expecting her to step out at any moment, but she didn't. I headed home, convinced that I was blowing things out of proportion. Maybe they'd just gone to a different location for drinks. But as soon as I walked through our front door, I noticed something odd. Her phone on the table, unlocked. It was vibrating with messages. I'd never snooped on her, but at that moment, I couldn't stop myself. I picked it up, the screen already lit with a message preview from Ben. It read, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow." Last night was unforgettable. My stomach twisted. I scrolled through their conversation, reading message after message of inside jokes, pet names, plans they'd made together, things she'd never told me. It was like looking at a version of her I didn't know, someone she'd never shown me. The messages went back months. When she got home later, she saw me standing there, her phone in my hand, and froze. I didn't say anything at first, just looked at her, waiting for an explanation. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then mumbled, "I didn't want you to find out like this." It hit me that she'd been prepared for this moment, that she'd been living in two worlds, just waiting for them to collide. We argued for hours, or rather, I argued and she stared at the floor, not once meeting my gaze. She gave half-hearted explanations, something about feeling disconnected, how she thought we'd grown too comfortable. The phrases felt empty, rehearsed, like she was reading from a script. The only thing that felt real was the pain that filled the room, thick and suffocating. I felt like I was drowning in it. In the days that followed, the apartment became unbearable. Every corner held memories, reminders of our life together. I'd sit on the couch, looking at the spot where she'd curl up with her coffee in the mornings, where we'd stay up late talking about nothing and everything. She moved out quietly, without a scene, leaving only a few boxes she'd said she'd come back for. But she never did. I didn't even notice until weeks later that her favorite jacket was still hanging in the closet, or that her toothbrush was still next to mine in the bathroom. At first, I tried to reach out. I'd send her long messages, pouring out everything I felt, everything I wished I'd said sooner. But her responses were short, detached, like she was talking to a stranger. I'd see her online late at night and wonder if she was talking to him, if she was laughing in that same way that used to be just for me. It was maddening. One night, a mutual friend invited me to a gathering, and after weeks of isolation, I forced myself to go. I felt like I was moving underwater, like everything around me was muted. People made small talk, laughing and joking, but I was barely there. Then, in the middle of a conversation, my phone buzzed. It was Nina. Just a single line. "Can we talk?" I didn't know if I felt relief, anger, or if I even wanted to hear what she had to say, but I found myself replying anyway. We met in a small cafe, the same one where we'd had countless dates, and seeing her walk and felt surreal. She looked different, somehow more composed, but also like she was carrying the weight of everything we'd been through. She sat down, her eyes shifting to the side, and I could tell she was struggling to find the right words. Finally, she looked up and said, "I didn't plan for any of this. I didn't mean to hurt you." I sat there, listening as she explained, said all the things I'd wanted her to say weeks ago. She talked about how she'd felt stuck, how she'd wanted excitement, something new. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to reach across the table, hold her hand, ask her to come back. But another part of me, the part that had been broken, couldn't forgive her, couldn't let go of the betrayal. I realized in that moment that the person I'd loved, the one I thought I knew inside and out, wasn't the person sitting across from me. After that day, I stopped looking for closure. Some things just don't end neatly, and maybe that's okay. I threw myself into work, took up running, went on trips alone. Slowly, I found myself again, in bits and pieces. And while the pain faded, a scar remained, a reminder of what had once been, of who I'd been with her and who I became without her. Months later, I ran into her at a park. She was laughing, surrounded by a group of friends, looking carefree in a way I hadn't seen in years. She saw me, waved briefly, and went back to her conversation, as if we were just two acquaintances who'd once crossed paths. And in a strange way, that's all we were. The chapter of us was over, and for the first time, I felt free to move on. I never wanted things to end this way. But looking back, I know that sometimes we lose people so we can find ourselves again. And that's what Nina had become, a memory, a lesson, a piece of my past. And I was finally ready to leave it there. It was my first night back home after nearly a decade away. I'd inherited my grandfather's house, the old stone cottage he'd left behind when he passed. And though it was run down and practically swallowed by the forest, I felt a strange obligation to go there, to see the place he'd always wanted me to inherit. The house had been part of my life since I was a kid. I remembered running through the dense woods, the scent of pine and wildflowers, and my grandfather's stories of the forest holding secrets. But as I got older, those memories faded, pushed aside by my busy life in the city. Now, standing on the front steps, looking up at the empty windows that stared back at me like dead eyes, I felt a strange shiver, an old fear that I couldn't quite place. Inside, everything was exactly as I remembered it. My grandfather's things were untouched. Old books stacked on dusty shelves, mismatched rugs covering the warped wooden floor, strange little trinkets he'd collected over the years. There was no electricity, and it was dark, the only light coming from the old lantern I'd brought with me. I set up a makeshift bed in the living room, too tired to do much else, and lay down, listening to the unfamiliar silence. But I couldn't sleep. There was something odd about the house that night, a faint pressure in the air like it was holding its breath. Every creak of the floor, every rustle of leaves outside, made my heart race. I kept telling myself it was just my nerves, just the lingering memories of the stories my grandfather used to tell me. Around midnight, I heard the knocking. It was soft at first, a faint tapping like someone knocking on a window. I sat up, clutching the lantern, heart pounding. The sound came again, 3 slow, steady knocks, then silence. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was the wind, but it didn't feel like the wind. The knocks were deliberate, as if someone was testing the boundary of the house, seeing if anyone was awake. I stayed up the rest of the night, gripping the lantern, jumping at every sound. When dawn finally broke, I forced myself to go outside, to check the windows, but I found nothing. No marks, no signs of anyone having been there. That was the first night. The second night, I convinced myself it was all in my head. I'd grown up on ghost stories, and now, alone in an old house in the woods, I was letting them get the better of me. But as soon as the sun set, the feeling returned, the strange tension, the prickling sense that something was watching. I kept telling myself it was just an old house settling, but then the knocking came again, louder this time, more insistent. This time, I followed it. The sound seemed to move, echoing through the empty house, first coming from the living room window, then the kitchen, then somewhere near the back door. I was chasing shadows, heart racing, certain I'd find someone there, lurking just out of reach. But every time I reached the source of the knocking, it stopped, moving just beyond me, staying one step ahead. When I finally gave up and went back to bed, I noticed something strange. One of the old family portraits on the wall, the one of my grandfather as a young man, looked different. His face, once stern and watchful, now seemed slightly off, as if he were smiling. I stood there, staring at it, but told myself I was imagining things, that the lack of sleep was getting to me. I went to bed, telling myself I'd leave the next morning, that it wasn't worth staying. But the next morning, When I packed up and tried to leave, the car wouldn't start. It was in perfect condition when I'd driven up, but now it just groaned and wheezed like the engine had died overnight. I walked the half-mile down the road, hoping to get cell service, but every time I thought I had a signal, it dropped. I felt an eerie sense of isolation, like the forest was closing in, as if the trees themselves were somehow working together to keep me there. That night, the knocking started before the sun had even set. I tried to ignore it, barricading myself in the bedroom, but it was no use. The knocks grew louder, more persistent, echoing through the walls, like someone was circling the house, testing every door and window. I heard a scratching sound, faint and rhythmic, coming from the floorboards. I wanted to run to get out of the house, but something about the darkness outside felt even more dangerous than the thing that was knocking. I stayed up all night, sitting in the center of the room with my lantern, watching the shadows flicker. When dawn finally broke, I felt a flood of relief, but I was also filled with dread. I was trapped, stranded in a house that seemed intent on holding me there, that seemed almost alive. The fourth night, something changed. I was lying in bed, listening to the knocking, trying to ignore it, when I heard a voice. It was faint, almost like a whisper carried on the wind, and it seemed to come from just outside the door. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. The voice was soft, familiar, and then I realized it was my grandfather's voice. "Come outside," he whispered. "I need to show you something." I froze, my mind racing. My grandfather had been dead for years, but there was no mistaking that voice. It was exactly as I remembered it, every inflection, every pause. I wanted to believe it was a trick, that I was imagining things, but the voice came again, insistent, calling my name. I don't know why, but I went to the door. I opened it, stepping out into the cold night air, and the forest stretched before me, dark and silent. The voice was gone, replaced by an overwhelming stillness, a quiet so deep it pressed against my ears. I felt a strange pull, like something was drawing me forward, deeper into the trees. I don't remember how long I walked. The forest felt endless, shifting around me, and I felt like I was being led, as if an invisible thread were pulling me forward. I tried to turn back, but every time I looked behind me, the house was gone, replaced by more trees, darker, thicker, pressing in. Finally, I reached a clearing. In the center stood a single, ancient tree, its twisted branches stretching up toward the sky. And there, hanging from one of its branches, was a small, tattered piece of fabric, a scrap of cloth, faded and worn, but unmistakable. It was a piece of my grandfather's old jacket, the one he'd worn every day of his life. I reached up to grab it, but as soon as I touched it, I felt a hand close around my wrist, cold and tight. I looked up, and there, standing beside me, was my grandfather, or at least something that looked like him. His face was pale, his eyes hollow, dark and unseeing. His mouth stretched into a wide, unnatural grin, a smile that didn't belong on his face, a smile that was too wide, too sharp. He held my wrist tightly, his grip cold as ice, and leaned close, whispering in that familiar voice, but with a tone that was somehow wrong. "I told you," he murmured, his breath cold against my skin. "I told you the forest holds secrets, and now you're part of them." I pulled away, stumbling back, but the forest was already closing in around me, the trees twisting and shifting, their branches stretching toward me like claws. I turned and ran, feeling the ground shifting beneath my feet, feeling like I was running through a dream that wouldn't let me wake up. When I finally broke through the trees, I was back at the house, gasping for breath, my heart pounding. I slammed the door behind me, locking it tight, and collapsed on the floor, shaking. I don't know how long I sat there, listening to the silence, waiting for the knocking to start again. I never went back outside after that. I never opened the door again. But every night, just after midnight, the knocking comes. It circles the house, tapping at every window, testing every door. And sometimes, when it's quiet, I hear my grandfather's voice, whispering from the shadows, telling me the forest is waiting, that there's still something left for me to find. And I know that one day, no matter how long I wait, no matter how tightly I lock the doors, I'll have to answer. In my early 20s, I worked as a house sitter. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough, and I got to stay in some pretty unique places. Most of the time, I just watered plants, fed pets, and watched movies in houses far nicer than any I could afford. I'd been doing it for a few years without anything stranger than the occasional creaky house settling at night. But then I got a job sitting a place I'll never forget. The owners were an elderly couple who were going out of town to visit their daughter for a month. Their house was tucked away in a quiet part of the countryside, about an hour outside the city. It was old, Victorian style, with lots of narrow, winding hallways and dark wood paneling that seemed to absorb every bit of light. From the outside, it looked beautiful, but inside, it felt like time had forgotten it. The couple warned me about the house's quirks. "The plumbing acts up sometimes," the woman said with a chuckle. "And there's one door upstairs that has a mind of its own. Don't let it spook you. It just swings open sometimes." She didn't seem worried, so I wasn't either. They showed me around, handed me the keys, and left me to it. The first few days were fine. I went about my business, enjoying the peace and quiet, and making use of the library on the second floor. I'd been warned that the upstairs rooms were drafty, and the house certainly lived up to that reputation. Even with the heating on, there was a constant chill that settled into my bones. But the strangest thing was that upstairs door, the one they told me about. The door was at the end of a long, dim hallway with faded wallpaper and a single light fixture that barely worked. Every time I walked past it, the door would be open a few inches, as if inviting me in. I closed it each time, firmly latching it, only to find it open again the next time I passed. After a few days, I stopped bothering, figuring it was just one of those quirks of old houses. But I started to notice something else too. Whenever the door was open, the hallway seemed different. It was subtle at first, a soft humming sound I could barely hear, almost like distant wind chimes, and a faint smell, like old books mixed with something metallic. I tried to ignore it, but as the days went on, the humming got louder and the smell more distinct. It wasn't just metallic, it was like rust or blood. I felt a strange urge to step inside the room, but I resisted. Something about it felt wrong, like I was standing at the edge of a cliff. One night, after about a week in the house, I woke up to the sound of footsteps above me. I was staying in the guest room on the first floor, and the footsteps were coming from directly overhead from that room. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, like someone pacing back and forth. My first thought was that someone had broken in, so I grabbed my phone and crept up the stairs, trying to be as quiet as possible. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw the door standing wide open. I don't know why, but I couldn't bring myself to go in. I just stood there, staring into the darkness beyond the doorway, as the footsteps continued back and forth, back and forth. I whispered, "Hello?" and the footsteps stopped dead silent. I held my breath, waiting, but there was no response. I told myself it was my imagination, that maybe it was just an animal or a trick of the old floors, and forced myself back downstairs, though I barely slept for the rest of the night. The next morning, I went into the room for the first time. It was a small, empty space with a single window overlooking the overgrown backyard. The wallpaper was peeling, and there was a strange, uneven bulge in the floorboards near the center of the room, like something was pressing up from beneath. The smell was worse in there, stale and sharp like decay. I knelt down and pressed on the bulge, thinking maybe a floorboard had warped over time. But it was firm, almost like there was something solid under there. My curiosity got the better of me, and I found a loose corner where the wood had splintered, giving me just enough room to pry up a section of the floor. Underneath the floorboard was a small, dark compartment about the size of a shoebox. Inside was a stack of old, yellowed papers tied with a fraying ribbon. I hesitated, glancing around as though someone might catch me, but then I picked up the papers and carefully untied the ribbon. They were letters, dozens of them, dated from the late 1800s. Most were written in a neat, cursive script, and as I read the first one, my skin began to crawl. They were love letters, but they weren't sweet or romantic. They were desperate, pleading, and each letter ended with the same line: "Let me out." The letters were addressed to someone named Clara, written by someone who only signed with the initial H. As I kept reading, the letters grew darker, more frantic. H described feeling trapped, like he was buried alive, and accused Clara of betraying him, of leaving him in darkness. The final letter was different. The writing was shaky, as though whoever wrote it could barely hold the pen. It read, "Clara, I am still here. I am waiting." At that moment, a cold breeze blew through the room, though the window was shut tight. My hands shook as I put the letters back and replaced the floorboard. I left the room, shut the door, and decided not to go back in. I didn't know what I'd stumbled onto, but whatever it was, it felt like it was waiting for something or someone. That night, I heard the footsteps again, slower this time, like someone dragging their feet. They started in the hallway, right outside my door, and stopped outside that room. I could hear the faint sound of humming, the same tune I'd been hearing in the hallways. But now, it was louder, closer, as if someone were humming right next to my ear. I didn't sleep at all. The next day, I called the couple, asking if they'd ever heard about anyone named Clara or H. They went quiet. Then the man, who hadn't said a word during the whole house tour, took the phone and said in a cold, quiet voice, "Stay out of that room." I wanted to leave right then and there, but I'd already been paid for the month, and I needed the money. So I stayed, though I avoided the upstairs as much as possible. But every night, without fail, the footsteps would start, and that door would open. Sometimes I'd catch glimpses of something, just out of the corner of my eye, a shadow moving through the hallway or standing in the doorway. It was tall, almost unnaturally so, with long arms that hung down by its sides. The final night, I woke up to the sound of creaking wood. I opened my eyes and felt my stomach drop. The door to my bedroom was slowly opening. Inch by inch, and beyond it, in the dim light from the hallway, I saw a figure standing, half hidden in shadow. Its head was tilted, as though it were watching me, waiting for me to move. It didn't speak, but I heard the words clear as day in my mind. "Let me out." I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, threw my things into a bag, and bolted out of that house, not stopping until I reached a gas station miles down the road. I never went back, and I didn't answer any calls from the owners. I still wonder about that room, about Clara and H, and whatever they trapped inside those walls. Every now and then, when I'm alone at night, I think I hear that same humming sound, distant but clear, as if it followed me home. The night it started, I was out of town on business, 3 hours away from my house. It was a boring sales conference in a chain hotel with bad food, worse coffee, and stale air conditioning that had been running since the Reagan era. The last speaker had just finished up, and I was trying to decide if I should grab a drink at the hotel bar or head straight to my room when my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text from my roommate, Luke. "Hey man, you took it back? Thought you were gone till tomorrow." I frowned, glancing at the time. 10:02 p.m. I texted him back. "I am gone till tomorrow. I'm still at the conference." A few seconds passed. Then came another message from Luke. Thought I saw someone in your room just now." Goosebumps prickled on my arms. I texted back. "You're joking, right?" 3 dots. A pause. Then, "No joke. Lights are on in there too. Thought you were just grabbing something you forgot." The drink could wait. I immediately dialed him, and he picked up after a couple of rings. "Luke, I'm serious. I'm not there," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. There was a short silence on the other end. Then he said, "Okay, so I'll go check it out. But if you're messing with me, you owe me a beer." I heard him walking down the hallway of our place, his footsteps echoing faintly through the line. "All right," he said, pushing open my door. "I don't see anyone." His voice trailed off, and I waited, feeling my pulse in my throat. "But dude," he finally said, "your closet door is open, and you never leave it open." He was right. I had a weird thing about keeping my closet closed, even when I wasn't home. It was one of those quirks I'd never been able to shake. "Can you shut it?" I asked, feeling absurd even as I said it. I heard him cross the room, then a slight, strained creak as he pulled the closet door shut. "All right, all good," he said. "Nothing else looks weird." But just as he said that, there was a muffled sound on his end, like a faint tap or knock. "Luke, you okay?" I asked, a chill creeping up my spine. He paused. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Something just knocked from inside the closet. We both went silent, and then the call dropped. I tried calling him back a dozen times, but each time it went straight to voicemail. I paced around my hotel room, the walls feeling smaller by the second, replaying our conversation in my head. Finally, after an hour of silence and missed calls, I told myself that he'd just gone to bed and that everything would be fine in the morning. The next day, I drove home, my stomach in knots the whole way. When I got to the house, Luke's car was in the driveway, but the house was dark, quiet. I let myself in, calling his name, but there was no answer. I found his phone lying on the kitchen counter, the battery drained. His keys were still on the hook by the door, and his shoes by the mat. It was as though he'd never left. I checked every room, heart pounding, until I reached my bedroom. My closet door was shut tight. I stood there, staring at it, trying to summon the courage to open it. Finally, I reached out, gripping the cold doorknob, and slowly pulled it open. It was empty. I exhaled, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. I told myself he must have gone out early or been picked up by someone. But as I shut the closet, I noticed something that hadn't been there before, a faint, smudged handprint on the inside of the door. Too high to be Luke's, too large to be mine. For the next few days, I lived alone in the house, hoping for a call or a message from him. But there was nothing. His friends hadn't seen him, and he didn't show up at work. I filed a missing person report, went through all his things, and called everyone who might have known where he went. Still nothing. Then, a week later, I came home late from work, and as I was passing my room, I heard a faint creak from inside. I froze, feeling that same prickling chill. I knew my room, knew every sound it made. This wasn't one of them. I slowly turned the handle and pushed the door open, only to find the room just as I'd left it. Everything in its place, nothing out of order. But my closet door, which I'd shut before leaving that morning, was open just a crack. I took a shaky breath, trying to calm myself, and went over to shut it. Just as I put my hand on the door, I felt a faint rush of cold air, as though someone had exhaled right next to my ear. My heart hammered, but I forced myself to pull the door shut and backed away, watching it, waiting to see if it would open again. That night, I slept on the couch. Over the next few days, things got worse. I'd wake up to find my closet door open in the mornings, even though I'd shut it the night before. Sometimes, I'd hear faint sounds coming from my room, soft, shuffling noises like footsteps, and the occasional muffled whisper I could never quite make out. I tried locking the closet, even wedging a chair against it, but nothing worked. Every night, I'd find it open again. Then one night, I heard the knocking. It was past midnight, and I'd been lying on the couch, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it, 3 slow, deliberate knocks from inside my bedroom closet. They echoed through the house, sending chills down my spine. I wanted to run, to leave the house and never come back, but something kept me rooted in place like a horrible compulsion. Finally, with a shaky breath, I crept toward my room. My hand hovered over the doorknob as I listened, waiting for another knock. But there was only silence. Slowly, I opened the door. My room was dark, quiet. The closet door was closed, but I could feel something there, a cold, heavy presence lurking just behind it. I stepped forward, reached out, and, heart pounding, pulled the door open. The closet was empty. No clothes, no boxes, nothing. Just an open, dark space, stretching back further than I remembered, as though the walls themselves had shifted, creating a narrow, yawning void that went deeper into darkness. I stared, trying to make sense of it, and then, from the farthest reaches of that darkness, I saw movement, a faint, shifting shadow, growing larger as it came closer. My breath caught, my heart racing as the figure came into view, half hidden in shadows. It was Luke, or something that looked like him. His face was pale, eyes wide and empty, as though he'd been wandering in that darkness for a lifetime. He took a step toward me, his movements slow, jerky, like he was struggling to remember how to walk. "Luke!" I whispered, my voice trembling. He stopped, staring at me, his mouth opening as though he wanted to say something. But no sound came out. Instead, he lifted a hand, pointing back into the darkness, where another figure began to emerge, and then another, each one stepping forward, filling the space. Faces I didn't recognize, each one pale, blank, eyes wide with a silent terror. I stumbled back, unable to tear my eyes away from them. They moved slowly, their gazes fixed on me, reaching out with hands that trembled in the dim light. "Help!" Luke whispered, his voice barely a breath. "It's so cold." Then, just as quickly as they'd appeared, the figures retreated, slipping back into the shadows, their faces fading until only Luke remained, his empty eyes holding mine. "You're next," he said, his voice hollow, echoing. Then he, too, stepped back, disappearing into the darkness, leaving only the faintest whisper behind him. The closet door swung shut on its own, and I stood there, frozen, my hand still gripping the knob, my mind reeling. I wanted to run, to leave that house and never look back. But something kept me there, rooted to the spot, staring at the closed door, feeling that same cold presence pressing in around me. And as I stood there, the knocking began again, slow, deliberate, from deep inside the closet. It began with a message, written in my own handwriting. I found it on my kitchen counter one night, scrawled on a torn sheet of paper, in ink that looked like it had been smudged by water. I was the only one with a key to my apartment, and I lived alone, so finding anything out of place was strange. But seeing my own handwriting, written in words I didn't remember writing, was something else entirely. The message was short. "Don't go into room 921. No signature, no other details. Just that single instruction. The building I lived in had exactly 7 floors, and I knew all of them well, having lived here for years. There was no room 921. The whole thing had to be some bizarre prank, or maybe a left-behind note from the previous tenant that somehow got tucked into my stuff during the move. But that didn't explain the handwriting. I put the note away, brushed it off, and went to bed, figuring the explanation would come to me in the morning. But that night, I dreamed of doors. Endless doors lining a narrow hallway, each one labeled with a small brass number, and every one of them unlocked, waiting for me to open it. I'd step through one door and find myself standing in front of another, identical door, like I was stuck in a loop. I woke up gasping, the number 921 flashing through my mind, even though I'd never seen it in real life. The next morning, my heart still pounding, I checked my apartment again, hoping to shake off the unease. But everything was exactly as I'd left it. The note was still there, and I had the strange urge to tear it up, like it was a spell I could break if I destroyed it. But something stopped me, a faint curiosity I couldn't quite dismiss. I shoved it in a drawer and tried to forget about it. But as the days passed, 921 seemed to follow me. I'd see it in the oddest places, on a license plate during my commute, as the price of a cup of coffee at a cafe I didn't remember visiting, even in the time on my digital clock, flashing 921 each night just as I glanced at it. It was as if something was nudging me, whispering in the spaces between thoughts. Finally, on a rainy Sunday afternoon, I decided to ask the building's super Mr. Rhodes about it. He was a tough, no-nonsense kind of guy, the type who always wore the same oil-stained ball cap and kept his conversation short. But when I mentioned room 921, his entire expression changed. He looked at me with an intensity one hadn't seen before. "There's number 921 in this building," he said firmly. "We only go up to 707. "I know," I replied. "I just thought maybe there was some part of the building I didn't know about. Or maybe another floor." His face paled, and he shifted uncomfortably. "Listen," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "If you see that room, or anything that seems out of place, you leave it alone. And don't go asking about it anymore." I left the conversation feeling more unsettled than ever. The way he looked at me, as if he were hiding something, it only made me want to know more. What was it about this non-existent room that made him act that way? That night, I stayed up late, replaying the conversation in my head. I was restless, almost buzzing with nervous energy. I got up to make some tea, and that's when I saw it, a light flickering under my door, spilling out into the hallway. I stepped closer, my heart thudding as I realized it was coming from just down the hall. The light was faint, pale yellow, like it was coming from an old bulb. And right at the end of the corridor, where the wall should have been blank, was a door. A single, plain door with a brass plate that read 921. I stood there for a long time, heart racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what I was seeing. This door hadn't been there yesterday. Hell, it hadn't been there an hour ago. But now it was as if it had been waiting for me all along. I wanted to turn around, to run back to my apartment and slam the door shut. But curiosity, always my worst trait, got the better of me. I took a deep breath and reached for the handle. It was ice cold under my hand, and as I turned it, the light grew brighter, almost blinding. Inside, the room looked like a hotel lobby, one of those outdated ones with floral wallpaper and thick carpet. The air was heavy with the scent of stale perfume, and soft, scratchy music played from somewhere I couldn't see. A reception desk sat in the middle, and behind it was a man wearing a suit, his back to me. I walked in, feeling like I was intruding on a place that wasn't meant for me. I cleared my throat, and the man turned slowly. His face was unsettlingly blank, like he was wearing a mask made of skin, his eyes dark and reflective. He looked at me as if he were seeing something he'd been expecting for a long, long time. "Welcome back," he said, his voice a low monotone. "It's been a while. I think there's been a mistake." I stammered, my voice echoing oddly in the stillness. "No mistake," he replied, his expression unchanging. "You left something behind. Come, it's waiting for you." He gestured to a door behind the reception desk, and though every instinct told me to leave, I felt myself drawn to it, my legs moving on their own. I stepped through, and suddenly I was no longer in a lobby. I was in a hotel room. The room was small and dimly lit, furnished with only a bed and a bedside table, on which sat a single item, a black, leather-bound notebook. I recognized it instantly, though I hadn't seen it in years. It was mine, a journal I'd kept through college, filled with all the usual angst and bad poetry. But I'd lost it, thought it had been thrown out with some old boxes during a move. I picked it up, the leather cool and smooth, and flipped through the pages. I recognized my handwriting, my old entries, my old thoughts. But as I turned the pages, something changed. There were words I didn't remember writing, entries from days I didn't recall. And as I read, the words began to blur, shift, rearrange themselves into sentences that didn't make sense. Phrases like, "They're watching," "Don't stay too long," and "You knew this would happen." My hands started to shake, and I closed the book, feeling the air grow colder around me. I looked up, and the walls of the room seemed to be pressing in, narrowing, closing the space between me and the door. I turned to leave, but the door was gone. Only a blank wall remained, and the room was shrinking, the walls inching closer, closer. Panicking, I pounded on the walls, screaming, hoping someone would hear. The man's voice echoed back at me from somewhere, calm and detached. "You can leave when you're ready to let go." I turned back to the notebook, now lying open on the floor. The words on the page had changed, spelling out a single sentence in bold, jagged script. "We're all just reflections." I blinked, and suddenly I was standing in my own apartment, the notebook in my hands. The room was quiet, the door to 921 gone, as if it had never been there. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding as I looked around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But when I looked at my reflection in the window, I saw a face staring back at me, a face that wasn't quite mine. The eyes were darker, the expression just slightly off, like someone was looking out through my skin. The reflection smiled, and in my own voice it whispered, "Welcome back." The first time I saw the window, I thought I was dreaming. It was late, probably 3 or 4 a.m., and I'd woken up thirsty. I stumbled to the kitchen in the dark, too groggy to bother with the lights. I'd lived in my apartment for 3 years and knew it well enough to navigate with my eyes closed. But as I filled my glass, I caught a strange reflection in the window over the sink, a glint of light that shouldn't have been there, a faint, warm glow. Curious, I leaned closer, and that's when I saw it. At first, it looked like a faint outline, just barely visible against the darkened street outside. But as I stared, the image grew clearer. It was another window framed in wood, right next to my own. It didn't belong there. There was no wall, no structure it could have been attached to. But as impossible as it seemed, there it was, as real as anything else, hanging in the empty air, like someone had cut a square into the night itself. The window was small, old-fashioned, with lace curtains that fluttered slightly, even though there was no wind. And inside, just barely visible through the glass, was a cozy room, softly lit by a single lamp. I couldn't see much: a chair, an old rug, a side table with a small vase of flowers. The scene looked timeless, like something out of an old photograph. It was the last thing I expected to see in the middle of the night in my fifth-floor apartment. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, even pinched myself, but the window stayed, as clear and vivid as ever. My heart pounded as I leaned closer, peering through the glass, half expecting to see someone inside. But the room was empty, quiet, and somehow inviting. Before I could think twice, I reached out and tapped on the glass, softly, just to see what would happen. To my shock, the curtains shifted. Slowly, like someone had heard me, I stumbled back, feeling my skin prickle with goosebumps. It was late, I told myself. I was tired, maybe even sleepwalking. I forced myself to turn off the water, ignoring the strange warmth of that window, and went back to bed, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. The next morning, the window was gone. The space above my sink was back to normal, just my own reflection staring back at me. I shook off the eerie feeling, deciding it had all been a bizarre dream. I went about my day, pushing the memory to the back of my mind. But the window came back the next night, and the night after that. At first, I tried to ignore it, but every time I woke up thirsty, there it was waiting for me, that strange, impossible window hanging beside mine. Each time, the scene inside shifted ever so slightly. The lamp might be turned off, or the flowers replaced with a small stack of books. A cozy quilt would appear draped over the chair. But no matter how many times I looked, the room was always empty. Then on the fifth night, I saw her. I'd woken up again, compelled to get up, and as I reached the kitchen, I felt my heart jump. There, standing by the chair in the glow of the lamplight, was a woman. She looked to be in her 30s, with dark hair pulled into a low bun and wearing an old-fashioned, pale blue dress that looked like something from the early 1900s. She didn't seem to notice me. Her gaze focused on something just out of sight. She looked lost, almost as if she'd forgotten what she was doing. I stared, my breath caught in my throat, wondering if she'd look up and see me. And then, just as I was about to tap on the glass again, her head turned ever so slightly, and she met my eyes. Her expression shifted, something dark and sorrowful passing over her face. She mouthed something, her lips moving slowly, but I couldn't make out the words. I leaned closer, mesmerized, trying to decipher her message, when suddenly, her hand shot up and pointed directly at me. Her eyes widened, and she mouthed again, this time urgently, her expression twisted with something like fear. This time I could make out what she was saying. "Don't open it." A chill swept over me, and I stumbled back, my heart racing. I glanced around, but the window in my kitchen was exactly as it should be. And when I looked back, the mysterious window was gone. The woman had vanished with it, leaving only the quiet stillness of my apartment. I barely slept that night. Her words echoed in my mind, haunting me. Don't open it. What had she meant? The window? My own door? The next morning, I felt the urge to tell someone, anyone, but I didn't know how to explain it without sounding insane. Who would believe me? By evening, I'd almost convinced myself it was just some strange recurring dream. But as midnight approached, I found myself drawn back to the kitchen, unable to resist checking for the window. Sure enough, it was there, its soft glow casting a warm, gentle light into the darkened kitchen. The woman was back, standing near the window, her gaze focused on the small side table where a thin, leather-bound book lay open. She didn't look at me this time, her expression thoughtful, distant. I knocked softly on the glass, and she looked up, a strange sadness in her eyes. She walked slowly toward the window, her movements almost reluctant, and raised her hand, pressing her palm to the glass. I mirrored her, reaching out, feeling an icy chill spread through my hand as if I'd touched frost. Her lips parted, and I strained to hear her voice, faint and distant, as if it were drifting across some vast, unseen distance. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't know it would open." A shiver ran down my spine. "What did you open?" I asked, my voice trembling. She looked at me with a strange intensity, her eyes wide and filled with something like regret. "It doesn't matter now, but you must listen to me. When it knocks, don't answer. No matter what." The light in the room began to flicker, casting strange shadows across her face. Her figure started to blur, her outline fading, as if she were sinking into darkness. Her eyes remained fixed on me, desperate, pleading. "When what knocks?" I demanded, panic rising in my throat. But her face was already fading, her image dissolving as the light in her room dimmed to a faint, flickering glow. Before she vanished entirely, she mouthed one final word, her voice like a whisper in the back of my mind. "Goodbye." The window blinked out, leaving me staring at my own reflection once again, my face pale and wide-eyed. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night, and for days afterward, I felt an uneasy sense of anticipation, like something was waiting just out of sight. I kept expecting to see the window return, to catch a glimpse of her face in the glass, but it never came back. The kitchen window remained normal, plain, and silent. I almost missed it, that strange glow, that room suspended in time. Then, 3 nights later, just as I was about to fall asleep, I heard it, a soft, hollow knock, echoing from somewhere in my apartment. I lay there, my heart pounding, straining to listen. The knock came again, louder this time, as if it were coming from the hallway just outside my bedroom door. Every muscle in my body tensed as the knocking grew louder, more insistent. It echoed through the apartment, rhythmic and relentless, like the ticking of some terrible, unseen clock. And then finally it stopped. The silence that followed was thick, suffocating. I lay there, barely breathing, waiting for it to start again. But instead, I heard something else, a faint, whispering voice, just outside my door calling my name. It was soft, distant, yet unmistakable. Slowly, I turned to look at the door, feeling my skin crawl as the voice called again, sweet and familiar, like an old friend. But I knew better. I knew better than to open it. I stayed there, eyes fixed on the door, ignoring the whispering voice, waiting for dawn to come. It started with a sound I couldn't place, a quiet hum that I felt more than heard. It would come on randomly, like a faint buzzing right behind my ears, a vibration that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I thought it might be my phone vibrating, but every time I checked, the screen was dark and empty. It wasn't loud, but the sensation felt unsettling, like someone whispering on the edge of my thoughts. After a few nights of this, I started noticing other things, subtle shifts around me. Little movements in my apartment, the way things seemed to shift ever so slightly. My coffee mug was on the left side of the sink when I was sure I'd left it on the right. I'd find lights on that I hadn't turned on, or my chair pulled away from my desk, even though I knew I hadn't sat there all day. I worked from home, so I thought maybe it was just cabin fever getting to me. But even when I went out, the feeling followed. I'd be in line at the store, half listening to the cashier ring up groceries, and suddenly I'd feel that hum again, buzzing under my skin. I'd catch myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing too close. But no one was there. It would fade as quickly as it came, leaving only that unsettling feeling, like a shadow had passed over me and left some trace behind. Things got stranger from there. I'd go to bed, close my eyes, and the next moment, I'd be awake, staring at the ceiling. Hours would have passed, and I'd be lying there, feeling wide awake, like I'd been conscious the whole time. But the real kicker was what I'd find in the morning. My phone open on the Notes app, filled with words I didn't remember typing. Just strings of phrases, disjointed thoughts, and single words that felt foreign to me. The first time it happened, the message was short, almost innocent. "It's almost ready." I deleted it without thinking, shook it off, and convinced myself it was a fluke. But the next morning, it was back, and this time, there were more lines. "You'll be so much better soon. You'll understand." I stared at the message, trying to remember if I'd typed it in a half-asleep haze, but there was no memory, nothing at all. I deleted it again, feeling my pulse race as I put my phone face down on the table. I told myself I was just sleepwalking or something, that I'd typed it while half awake. But the notes kept appearing. Every morning, a new message in my handwriting, each one longer than the last. And they were getting stranger. One morning, I found a full paragraph. "It's almost time now. You don't need to worry. It'll only hurt for a moment, and then you'll see. Then you'll know." I tried everything, locking my phone, hiding it, even putting it in a drawer across the room. But the messages kept appearing like they were being planted directly into my phone. And each time they were there, my own handwriting staring back at me. One night, I decided to test myself. I set up a camera on my desk, angled toward my bed, and hit record. I wanted to catch myself in the act, find out if I was the one writing those messages. I felt ridiculous setting it up, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening, something just out of sight. That night, I had the same experience as always. I closed my eyes, and it was like no time passed at all before I was awake again. Morning light streamed in, and I immediately went to check my phone. Sure enough, a new message was waiting for me. "Tonight." Heart pounding, I turned to the camera. I plugged it into my laptop and clicked play, half expecting to see myself get up in the middle of the night, sleepwalking to my phone. But what I saw was worse. So much worse. At first, it was just me, lying there in bed, breathing evenly, still as a statue. The room was quiet, the only sound a faint buzz from the clock on my desk. But then around 3 a.m., something changed. My body shifted, but not like a normal person rolling over. It was stiff, mechanical, like a puppet on strings. My head turned slowly to face the camera, my eyes open but glassy, unfocused. I watched myself sit up, arms moving stiffly, like I was being controlled by something else entirely. My face was blank, but my lips parted, and I began to whisper. The camera couldn't pick up what I was saying, but I could see my mouth moving, shaping words with a slow, deliberate rhythm. I felt sick watching it, that eerie calmness, the way my body moved as if it didn't belong to me. After a minute or two, my hand reached toward my phone, picked it up, and started typing. When I was done, I placed it back on the table, and then I lay back down, eyes still wide open, staring at the ceiling until the first light of dawn crept through the window. Only then did my eyes close, as if some spell had been lifted. I deleted the video immediately, my hands shaking. I didn't want to see it again, didn't want to think about it, but there was no escaping it. I couldn't ignore what I'd seen. That day, I left my apartment for the first time in days, just walked without a destination, hoping to shake the feeling of something crawling inside me. But the buzzing was back, stronger than ever, a vibration that pulsed with each step, like some silent metronome ticking down. As I wandered the city, I started seeing faces that looked familiar, too familiar. Strangers would glance at me, then quickly look away, as if they recognized me from somewhere. I was sure I'd never seen them before, yet they felt known to me, like half-remembered faces from a dream. One man, standing at the edge of the subway platform, locked eyes with me and mouthed something that made my blood run cold. Almost ready, I hurried home, but the apartment felt wrong now. The shadows seemed longer, the corners darker. I went to the bathroom to splash water on my face, but when I looked up, the reflection staring back at me wasn't my own. It looked like me, sure. Same hair, same face, same tired eyes. But there was something off, something in the way it watched me, almost expectant, like it was waiting for me to understand something I couldn't see. And then it smiled. It was the smallest smile, barely there, but it wasn't mine. It was a stranger's smile, something cold and unfamiliar. My stomach twisted, and I backed away, watching as my reflection did the same, that faint, unnatural smile never fading. That night, I tried to stay awake. I propped myself up with pillows, chugged coffee, kept my eyes wide open, determined to see if anything would happen. But at some point, sleep must have claimed me, because when I opened my eyes, the first light of dawn was already filtering through the window. And there, on the nightstand, was my phone, screen glowing with a new message. "It's done." My heart thundered as I read the words. I dropped the phone, backing away as if it had burned me. I checked the apartment, looked at myself in every mirror, but everything seemed normal. Except it wasn't. I felt lighter, like something vital had been scooped out. leaving an emptiness behind. In the days that followed, I noticed changes in myself. I started saying things I didn't mean, phrases slipping out in conversations, things that sounded foreign and detached. People at work would give me strange looks, ask if I was feeling okay. Sometimes, I'd catch myself laughing at things that weren't funny or staring blankly at nothing, lost in thoughts that didn't feel like mine. And then, a few nights later, I got another text from the same unknown number. "Welcome back." I stared at the message, a chill running down my spine. My fingers moved to delete it, but before I could, another message appeared. "We're ready now, just like you wanted." I tried to type back, demand answers, anything, but my body wouldn't respond. My hands felt heavy, stiff, like they belonged to someone else. And that's when I realized whatever had been watching me, controlling me, it had already taken over. Now, I'm only a passenger, a faint echo buried inside, watching my body move, my mouth speak, my hands type words I don't recognize. I don't know who I am anymore, or if there's anything left of me at all. I only know that whatever's in control, it's waiting for something, preparing for some end I can't see. And every time I try to scream, the words that come out aren't mine. It all started with the voices on the tapes. I was clearing out my late uncle's storage unit, a small, stuffy box filled with things I'd never known he owned. Old furniture, dusty books, boxes upon boxes of cassette tapes. My uncle had always been a quiet man, a little eccentric, someone who preferred old technology to anything remotely modern. He passed away unexpectedly, leaving behind a sprawling mess of things that nobody else in the family seemed interested in sorting through. The tapes were stacked haphazardly, dozens of them, with scrawled labels on their spines. Tuesday, Market Sounds, Waves at Midnight, City, Evening, May 22nd. The handwriting was barely legible, as if he'd written them in a hurry or in the dark. Curious, I picked up a tape labeled Apartment 5C, Late Night. I didn't remember my uncle ever living in an apartment building, and even if he had, this felt strange, like an audio diary from someone else's life. Back in my place, I dusted off my old cassette player, popped in the tape and pressed play. The static was immediate, a soft crackling that filled the room, and then silence. I waited, almost about to give up, when faint sounds began to emerge. The creak of floorboards, a door closing somewhere in the distance, the low hum of appliances. It was quiet, mundane, but something about it felt so personal, so familiar. Then came the voices. It was subtle at first, a single voice speaking in a low murmur, almost as if trying not to be heard. I strained to make out the words, but couldn't quite catch them. Then another voice joined, slightly louder, in a tone that was almost pleading. I leaned closer to the speaker, trying to make sense of the conversation, but it was as if they were speaking from underwater, muffled, distorted. I could only pick up snatches of phrases, things like "it has to be this way," and "you know what you have to do." I fast-forwarded, listening here and there, but it was always the same. The two voices, one calm, one increasingly frantic, each phrase slipping in and out of clarity like fragments from a half-remembered dream. That night, I couldn't get the voices out of my head. They echoed in my mind, especially the one that had sounded so desperate. There was something in that tone, a rawness that felt real, like someone was genuinely afraid, pleading for something. The next day, I went back to the storage unit and grabbed more tapes, taking home as many as I could carry. One by one, I listened to them, trying to piece together some kind of narrative, but none of them made any sense. Every tape was a snapshot of ambient sounds, footsteps in hallways, water dripping in some unseen sink, rain on a window. Some of the tapes were labeled with dates, others with times of day, like 3:15 a.m., hallway. And in almost all of them, I'd catch a fragment of those same voices. Sometimes they'd argue. Sometimes they'd just sit in silence. Other times, I'd hear what sounded like quiet, restrained sobbing. One night, I found a tape labeled Simply Home. I felt a chill as I slipped it into the player. My hands were shaking, though I couldn't explain why. I pressed play, and the recording started as expected, a crackle of static, a long pause. And then, out of the silence, came a sound that made my heart race. It was a faint creak and then a shuffle, The unmistakable sound of someone moving around a room. But this time, I recognized the noises. They were the sounds of my own apartment. I froze, listening as the sounds grew clearer. Footsteps across the hardwood floor. The soft rattle of the window latch. The squeak of the loose floorboard by my bed. I could even hear the faint ticking of my kitchen clock, a sound so familiar, I barely noticed it anymore. The realization hit me like ice. This tape was a recording of my own home. I sat there, paralyzed, as the sounds continued, soft and rhythmic, as if someone were pacing the room. And then, out of nowhere, a voice spoke, clear and close, like someone was standing right behind me. "She can't hear us yet." I whipped around, heart pounding, but of course, no one was there. I fumbled to stop the tape, but the voice continued, each word sharp and distinct. "It'll be soon," the voice said, sounding almost amused. I pressed stop, but the tape kept playing. The footsteps continued, coming closer, louder, until it felt like they were right next to me. I tore the tape out of the player, heart racing, and threw it across the room. Silence fell, but I could still feel that presence, like someone was standing just out of sight, waiting for me to turn my back. The following night, the nightmares began. I'd wake up to the sound of faint whispers, the same words looping over and over. "She can't hear us yet. She can't hear us yet." Each night, the voices grew louder, clearer, until it felt like they were coming from inside my own head. I'd sit up, drenched in sweat, my apartment cloaked in shadows, and feel like I was being watched from every corner. One night, as I lay awake in bed, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my door. Soft, slow, deliberate, each step echoing down the silent hall. I told myself it was a neighbor, someone coming home late, but as the footsteps paused outside my door, I held my breath. And then, a whisper drifted through the air, faint but unmistakable. "Let us in." I clamped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, willing the voice to go away. But it was too late. The door rattled softly, and I felt a cold draft slip through the cracks, brushing against my skin. When I finally dared to open my eyes, I saw it. A figure standing in the doorway, shrouded in shadows, watching me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The figure took a step forward, and in the dim light, I saw its face, my own face, twisted in an expression of hollow emptiness, eyes blank and unseeing. It spoke, and the voice was my own. "You're listening, finally," it said, a slight smile tugging at the corners of its mouth. I blinked, and it was gone. The room was empty, silent, as if nothing had happened. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. The air still felt charged, heavy with the weight of something that shouldn't be there. The next day, I tried to get rid of the tapes. I loaded them into a bag, walked to the nearest dumpster, and tossed them in, heart pounding with relief. But that night, when I got home, the bag was sitting on my doorstep, every tape accounted for. I knew then that I was trapped, that whatever was in those recordings had attached itself to me. I spent the next few days trying to ignore the tapes, but they haunted me. At night, I'd hear them whispering from the drawer where I'd locked them away, faint voices calling my name, urging me to listen. I tried drowning them out with music, with television, but it was useless. The voices seeped into my mind, into my dreams, weaving themselves into the fabric of my thoughts. Finally, I gave in. I sat down, pulled out the tapes, and started listening one by one. Hours passed, the sounds filling my apartment, the voices blending together in a symphony of whispers, memories, fragments of lives I'd never lived. I lost track of time, my mind drifting in and out of strange, surreal visions. Rooms that looked like mine but weren't, shadows slipping through walls, faces that looked familiar yet wrong. And then, on the final tape, I heard something that chilled me to the bone. It was my own voice, speaking softly, as if leaving a message for someone. "If you're hearing this," it said, "then I've already gone too far. Don't try to find me. I'm part of it now." The voice paused, and then continued, quieter, almost a whisper. "There are other worlds here, just behind the walls. I thought I could listen without falling in, but I was wrong. And now, I can't get out." The tape clicked, fell silent, and I sat there, stunned, feeling like I was on the edge of a vast, unfathomable void. Now, the tapes are all I hear. I play them on a loop, listening to the voices, the footsteps, the fragments of lives brushing up against my own. I don't know where my uncle found them, or how they came to be. All I know is that I can't stop listening. They've become part of me, their whispers woven into my thoughts, their shadows blending into mine. And sometimes, in those rare moments of silence, I catch myself whispering along with them, my voice slipping into the same familiar phrases. I'm no longer sure where their words end and mine begin. I just know that I'm part of it now, part of whatever lives in the static, in the space between sounds, in the cracks of reality. And maybe someday someone else will find my voice on a tape too.